The water around the Hoenn region holds more than currents and coral. It holds questions that have never fully been answered, mysteries written into the lore and landscape of a world that still feels alive long after the screen goes dark. There are creatures in Hoenn whose origins were never fully explained, places whose purpose remains uncertain even today, and designs that carry meanings most players never noticed. Settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokemon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. Hoenn arrived in the early years of the Game Boy Advance era, a region shaped by warmth and water in equal measure. Its design drew from the southern islands of Japan, where volcanic mountains rise close to tropical coastlines, and the ocean is never far from view. This geography gave Hoenn a texture unlike any region before it. The air felt different here. Even the music carried something warmer, something with more breathing room between the notes. The mysteries of Hoenn did not announce themselves. They rested quietly in the corners of the map, in the behavior of creatures that appeared only rarely, in the ruins that offered no explanations, and in the hidden locations that some players spent entire childhoods trying to find. These were not puzzles designed to be solved quickly. They were invitations to wonder, and tonight we accept all of them. The ancient texts, found carved into stone walls throughout Hoenn, were written in a script that the games referred to simply as Braille. This choice was deliberate and remarkable. Rather than inventing a fictional language for an ancient civilization, the designers used a real tactile alphabet known across the world. The Braille inscriptions found at the sealed chambers of the Regis trio contained actual readable messages for anyone who knew the system. Each chamber held a different instruction. One asked the player to use strength in darkness. Another called for rain. A third required waiting with patience, the kind of patience that mirrors the slow rhythm of an ancient place that has no reason to hurry. These were not decorative inscriptions. They were functional keys, and players who did not recognize the alphabet had to rely on other players, on older siblings, on guides passed around playgrounds like small treasures. The fact that a real-world sensory language was embedded in a fantasy game created something unusual. It invited players into a system they might never have encountered otherwise. For some children, Braille in Hoenn was the first time they became aware the alphabet existed at all. That quiet educational thread woven into an adventure game is part of what makes these mysteries feel like they carry genuine weight. The chambers themselves were scattered across the region in a way that required deliberate exploration. The desert ruins sat in the warm expanse of Route 111, partially buried and mostly silent. The island cave rested along the northern coast, visible from the water, but reachable only on foot. The ancient tomb stood inland near the end of a long road, the quietest of the three. None of them offered a warm welcome. All of them rewarded the persistent. Regirock was the creature sealed inside the desert ruins, and its body told its own story without a single word of explanation. It was constructed entirely from brown rock, with no organic features, no visible face in the traditional sense, and no expression that changed. Its design suggested great age, the kind of age that belongs more to geology than to biology. Rock formations that took thousands of years to reach their current shapes might understand something about what Regirock was meant to represent. Its markings formed a simple grid of dots across its surface, echoing the braille that unlocked its chamber. This visual repetition connected the creature to its context in a way that felt intentional and considered. Regirock was not merely an inhabitant of the ruins. It was part of them. Its body was made from the same substance as its prison, and the boundary between the two was deliberately unclear. In competitive play, Regirock occupied a quiet but respected role. Its defense statistics placed it among the sturdiest physical walls available in its generation. Players who discovered it often used it not for dramatic victories, but for stubborn endurance, for the ability to absorb punishment and remain standing when other creatures had long since fallen. There was something thematically appropriate about that. A creature of ancient stone, enduring in a world that had moved on around it. Regis followed a different logic. Its body was harder than any known metal, and its surface was said to have contracted over millions of years as the planet itself cooled. It lived in the ancient tomb, the most remote of the three chambers, and its design suggested a creature that had not been made but had formed slowly through pressure and time. It looked like something geology might produce, rather than something a civilization could have built deliberately. The lore surrounding all three Regis hinted at a connection to an ancient civilization that no longer existed anywhere else in Hoenn. No ruins of that civilization remained outside these chambers. No other artifacts appeared. The chambers themselves were the only evidence that such a people had ever walked the region, and the creatures sealed within were their last legacy. This absence of context made the mystery feel genuine rather than constructed. Regis inhabited the island cave and presented perhaps the most visually striking of the three designs. Its body appeared to be formed from ancient ice, glacier ice of the kind that takes centuries to form and carries within it the compressed memory of older atmospheres. The spikes extending from its form gave it a geometric quality, as though it had crystallized rather than grown, as though it belonged to a process of physics rather than biology. The island it called home was surrounded by water and reachable only through careful navigation along the northern coastline. The approach to the cave felt deliberate, the kind of journey that prepares you for something quiet and significant. Players who arrived at the correct entrance found nothing at first, just stone and silence. The Braille inscription inside asked for a single thing: to wait in place without pressing any other button for 2 full minutes. 2 minutes of stillness in a video game is an unusual demand. For players accustomed to constant interaction, to pressing buttons and making choices, this pause felt strange. But it also felt appropriate for a creature associated with ancient ice, with slow geological time, with the kind of patience that has no use for urgency. The waiting itself became part of the ritual, and rituals shape how we remember things. The connection between the three Regis and a fourth creature named Regis would not be revealed until a later generation of games, but the mystery of that connection reached backward and changed how players looked at Hoenn in retrospect. The legend held that Regis had shaped the continents of the world by pulling them across the oceans, using nothing but its tremendous physical strength, and that the three elemental Regis had been created from ice, rock, and steel found during that ancient journey. This backstory gave the sealed chambers a new quality when revisited. They were not prisons in the punitive sense, but containers designed to keep something safe, or perhaps to keep the world safe from something that was not yet needed. The Braille messages were not warnings, but instructions left by a civilization that understood the creatures would eventually be found and wanted to ensure that finding them required a certain kind of person, one patient enough to read old texts and careful enough to follow them exactly. The ruins themselves said nothing about who had built them. No names appeared in any inscription. No symbols suggested a culture beyond the single act of preservation. This namelessness made the builders feel larger somehow, as though naming them would have reduced them. The mystery of who sealed the Regis was never answered in Hoenn, and it remains unanswered, a quiet space that the imagination fills differently for every player who thinks about it. The weather of Hoenn was never simply backdrop. It was mythology given mechanical form. Groudon and Kyogre represented two of the oldest forces in the world's creation story, and their conflict had already ended long before any player arrived. The evidence of what they had done existed in the shape of the region itself, in the vast oceans that covered most of the map, and in the single volcanic mountain that rose from the center of the land. Mount Chimney was Hoenn's most visible geological feature. It erupted gently in the background of certain encounters, and its presence reminded players that the land beneath their feet was never entirely still. The crater at its peak held residual energy, and the villain organizations that appeared throughout the games recognized this. The mountain was not merely scenery, it was a symbol of the same forces that had shaped the world's mythology, fire and pressure, and the slow movement of things too large and too old to be reasoned with. Groudon's design drew from deep geological imagery. Its body was plated like rock formations, its interior glowing with the light of something beneath the crust rather than above it. The cracks of orange and red that showed through its joints suggested that it carried the Earth's heat inside itself, that it was less a creature living on the land than a creature made of land. Its creation of continents was not described as labor, but as a natural consequence of its movement, the way a tide shapes a shoreline simply by existing. Kyogre inverted this completely. Where Groudon was angular and solid, Kyogre moved with the fluid certainty of deep water. Its markings evoked ancient sea symbols, and the two crescent shapes on its pectoral fins felt like they belonged on pottery from an old maritime culture, rather than on a creature from a modern adventure game. The blue of its body deepened toward its edges, becoming the color of water where light no longer reaches, and this gradient carried a sense of something that extended further than could be measured. The Cave of Origin sat quietly in the city of Sotopolis, and reaching it required entering a city that could only be accessed by diving beneath the water and ascending through a hidden opening beneath the cliffs. This journey, descending into the ocean and then rising into a hidden caldera city, felt like a passage through myth rather than geography. Sotopolis itself was built inside a crater that the ocean had filled, giving it the quality of a place that remembered something catastrophic and had chosen to grow beautiful in the aftermath. Inside the Cave of Origin, the ancient Pokémon at the center of the region's myth waited in its primal form. The encounter felt appropriately solemn. The cave had no music in certain versions, only ambient sound, and the creature that filled it radiated the kind of authority that comes not from aggression, but from simply being something very old and very powerful in a very small space. The lore of the Cave of Origin suggested that it was the place where the land or sea Pokémon had come to rest in the long interval between the ancient conflict and the present day. It was not a prison, but a resting place, and the conditions that called the creature back to wakefulness were tied directly to the choices of the villainous teams. This gave the player's intervention a weight it might not otherwise have had. You were not simply catching a legendary. You were participating in the resolution of something the world's own mythology had left unfinished. The sky pillar rose from the eastern reaches of the ocean like something that had always been there and always would be. It stood on a small island, accessible only after significant progress through the story, and its upper floors required a bicycle with specific tires to navigate. Without the mock bike, the crumbling floor sections could not be crossed. This mechanical requirement gave the climb a practical difficulty that matched its narrative one. You needed the right preparation to reach what waited at the top. Rayquaza rested at the summit, sleeping in the way that very old things sleep, deeply and without concern for how long it had been. Its body was designed like something between a serpent and a heavenly body, green and scaled with intricate yellow markings that suggested circuitry or ancient calligraphy, depending on how you looked at them. It lived in the ozone layer, so high above the world that neither the ocean conflicts below nor the volcanic activity of the land concerned it. It was the third balance, the one that existed above both extremes. The design choice to make Rayquaza's home nearly inaccessible, created an appropriate sense of distance from the creature. It was not hiding exactly. It simply lived somewhere that most things could not reach. The layers of the sky above Hoenn were its territory, and the sky pillar was less its residence than its occasional perch, the one place where the very high and the very terrestrial briefly touched. Its role in the ancient myth was that of mediator, the force that descended from above to end the conflict between land and sea. The imagery of something from the sky intervening in an argument between earth and ocean felt genuinely mythological, the kind of story structure that appears independently in cultures across the real world because it maps so naturally onto the physical relationship between those three elements. The southern island was one of Hoenn's quieter secrets, accessible only through a special item that most players never legitimately obtained. On that island rested either Latias or Latios, depending on the version of the game, and the one not found there would roam freely across the entire region in the way that certain legendary creatures have roamed through the games since the first generation. The roaming mechanic gave these creatures an unusual quality. They were present in the world but not fixed to any location. They moved between routes as the player moved, creating an ongoing awareness that somewhere in Hoenn, a creature of considerable mystery was also traveling. The act of encountering them was partly luck and partly careful management of the map, and the moment of contact carried an energy that stationary encounters could not replicate. Latias and Latios were designed around the idea of levitation and the visual language of a jet's swept-back wings. Their streamlined forms and smooth, featureless surfaces made them look like they had been designed for speed through air rather than through water. The choice to make them dragon and psychic types, with no connection to the region's dominant water themes, gave them a quality of being from somewhere else, visiting Hoenn rather than belonging to it. The bond between the two was a recurring theme in the extended media surrounding them. A film told the story of a Latios whose sacrifice preserved the city of Alto Mare, and this narrative of one twin giving something of itself for another presence shaped how many players understood both creatures. Finding them in the wild, after knowing that story, gave the encounter a different weight. The one that lived was the one still moving. Phoebus was perhaps the most deliberately obscure Pokémon in Hoenn's roster. It could be found in only 6 random tiles on a single river route, and those tiles changed daily based on a number that the player could not see or control. The river in question was long and surrounded by other Pokémon that appeared far more frequently, meaning that the search for Phoebus required fishing methodically across every square of water with no guarantee of success before the day reset. The creature found at the end of that search was intentionally underwhelming. Phoebus resembled a battered fish, its scales patchy, and its appearance suggesting neglect rather than mystery. The game offered no indication that it was anything special. Players who had not heard of it from other sources would likely have released it without a second thought. The transformation it was capable of was entirely hidden behind a system that most players did not know existed. Its beauty condition, measured through contest statistics and fed through specific berries, needed to reach a maximum value before it could evolve. This requirement had nothing to do with battling. It had nothing to do with levels or held items or time of day. It required an entirely different mode of engagement with the game, one that the main story never required and never explained. The creature that emerged from that hidden process was melodic, and the contrast was startling. Where Phoebus was visually forgettable, melodic was elaborately beautiful, long and pale, with rose-colored markings and a tail that split into multiple flowing fins. Its design drew from the imagery of sea serpents in their most graceful interpretation, creatures associated with the deep and with beauty and with the kind of calm that comes from great power held gently. The deliberateness of this contrast was the point. The designers had embedded a story about transformation and perception into the game's mechanics without writing a single word of explanation. Phoebus looked like something worth ignoring. Melodic was something worth seeking. The path between them required players to engage with a system built around aesthetics rather than combat, and the lesson embedded in that path was quiet but unmistakable. The fossils of Hoenn presented a different kind of mystery. The claw fossil and root fossil appeared as a one-time choice, offered to the player at a site where ancient remains had been excavated. Each contained the compressed remnants of something from a very old version of the world, and reviving them required visiting a facility that the game described with the language of science rather than myth. A North emerged from the claw fossil, a small creature that moved like a horseshoe crab but carried the visual grammar of a scorpion. Its evolutionary form, Armaldo, grew into something considerably more imposing, an upright creature with heavy plating and the body plan of an ancient marine predator that had decided to try living on land. The transition between the two forms suggested a creature in the middle of an evolutionary story that stretched across geological time. Lilip came from the root fossil, and its design drew from crinoids, the feathered sea creatures that appear in the fossil record under names like sea lilies. These organisms were not plants, despite resembling them, and the game quietly preserved this ambiguity. Lilip looked floral. It behaved like an animal. Its evolutionary form, Cradley, was stranger still, a bipedal creature that retained the tentacled crown of its pre-evolution, but now moved through the world upright, its body still bearing the colors and textures of something that belonged on the seafloor. What made these fossil Pokémon particularly resonant in Hoenn was the region's own emphasis on ancient things. The Regis ruins, the Cave of Origin, the Sky Pillar, all of these spoke to a world with deep layers of history beneath its visible surface. The fossil creatures fit naturally into that larger story, pieces of a world that had existed long before the current one and left its record behind in stone. The abandoned ship drifted in the waters between roots, as a location with no clearly explained purpose and no resolution to the questions it raised. It had once been called the SS Cactus, and something had happened aboard it that had left both the ship and its story unfinished. Players who explored its tilting corridors found water pooling in the lower decks, storage rooms with personal items still inside, and a puzzle involving keys that opened cabinets and doors leading deeper into what remained. The puzzle had a practical reward, an item called the scanner that could be exchanged for something useful. But the ship itself offered no explanation for what had happened. No survivors appeared, no logs provided context. The personal belongings in the rooms were simply there, quiet evidence of people who had once occupied the space and were now absent. The game offered this atmosphere without comment and without resolution. This approach to environmental storytelling asked players to fill the gap themselves. The ship felt genuinely abandoned in the way that real abandoned places feel, not cleaned or staged, but simply left, as though everyone who had been there had stopped in the middle of something and not returned. The mild horror of that image, the interrupted ordinary life, was delivered entirely through object placement and water effects rather than through dialogue or cutscene. Some players spent time in the abandoned ship searching for something they never found because the atmosphere suggested there was more to discover. The feeling that a place holds a secret is sometimes more powerful than any actual secret, and the ship's designers understood this. The absence of explanation was itself the design choice. The town of Pacifid Log rested on logs, floating in the middle of the open ocean, its buildings connected by wooden platforms above water that moved constantly beneath. It was the furthest settlement from the mainland and the one that felt most genuinely isolated from the rest of the region. The current flowing east of Passivhaglog was strong enough to push the player away and required specific navigation to overcome. The old man who lived in the town and spent his days looking east toward Mirage Island was one of Hoenn's gentlest mysteries. He was looking, and he had been looking, and the game implied he had been doing this for a very long time. He would tell the player whether Mirage Island was visible that day, because the island's appearance was tied to an internal game value that changed every 24 hours and matched a number carried by one of the player's Pokémon. The probability of that match occurring on any given day was small enough that many players tried every day for the entirety of their time in Hoenn and never saw it appear. The old man's vigil began to feel meaningful in the context of that difficulty. He was waiting for something that might or might not come, with the particular patience of someone who has decided that the waiting itself is worthwhile regardless of the outcome. When Mirage Island did appear, it held a patch of tall grass where a small, rare creature called Winot could be found. Winot was a pre-evolution introduced in this generation, and its connection to a later Pokémon raised gentle questions about how such a creature came to live on an island that most travelers would never reach. The island appeared and disappeared without explanation, and the creatures on it continued their lives, indifferent to whether anyone could see them. The Trick House along Route 110 was one of Hoenn's stranger recurring locations, a building where the man who owned it rearranged the interior puzzle each time the player earned a new badge. He was always present, but almost impossible to see at first, hiding behind furniture or behind curtains in ways that rewarded the attentive eye. Once found, he would invite the player into the current version of his challenge. The challenges themselves escalated in complexity as the game progressed, moving from simple navigation through tall grass to mazes involving push blocks, sliding floors, and questions about game mechanics. Each completion offered a small reward and the owner's genuine delight. He seemed to take real pleasure in watching someone solve what he had built, and this quality gave the location a warmth that its puzzle-dense format might otherwise have lacked. The mystery of the Trick House was not about any hidden lore or unexplained event. It was about a person who had decided that the most meaningful thing they could do in the world was create challenges for strangers and then hide themselves as the first puzzle of every visit. There was something quietly philosophical about that, an approach to community and purpose expressed entirely through architecture and behavior rather than words. Sotopolis City sat inside a crater lake accessible only to those who knew where to dive and where to surface. Its white stone buildings climbed the inner walls of the caldera and reflected in the still water below. The city had no connection to the surrounding land routes, reachable only through water, and this isolation gave it an air of having existed separately from the rest of Hoenn, developing its own relationship with the ancient forces that had shaped the region. The gym inside Sotopolis was built on ice, an unusual choice for a city surrounded by water in a warm tropical region. The puzzle required careful movement to avoid sliding into incorrect positions, and the leader who waited at the end of the ice floor was responsible for the gym that felt most architecturally incongruous with its setting. The contrast was not accidental. Ice and water occupy the same elemental space in different states, and the gym's design made that relationship physical. The city's position within a crater connected it directly to the region's volcanic history. Sotopolis had grown inside the remnants of something catastrophic, and its beauty was inseparable from that origin. The water that filled the caldera was calm now, but the rock that surrounded it remembered fire. Walking through Sotopolis was, in a quiet way, walking through the aftermath of something ancient, and the city had made that aftermath into something worth living in. The safari zone in Hoenn operated differently from those in previous regions. Rather than a simple contained area, it split into sections with different terrain and required the player to invest significant time to unlock each area through conversation with its warden. The warden had placed conditions on access, counting the number of steps taken in each section before new terrain opened. This meant that accessing the full safari zone required multiple dedicated visits across many hours of play. Players who rushed to collect everything quickly found themselves turned away, their steps exhausted, their access restricted. The warden's system rewarded patience and return visits over systematic efficiency. The creatures available in the deepest sections of the safari zone were rare enough to justify the investment, but the journey itself was the more memorable element. The safari zone in Hoenn felt like a place that had its own rhythms, its own schedule, and its own expectations of the people who entered. You could visit, but you visited on its terms. The Pokeblock making system connected directly to both contests and the Phoebus evolution requirement, creating a network of systems that intersected in ways the game never explicitly taught. Making the right Pokeblocks required the right berries combined in the right proportions, and the berries themselves had to be grown over real time, using the berry planting system spread across routes throughout the region. Berry plants took actual hours or days to mature, connecting gameplay to the real world's clock in a way that felt organic rather than mechanical. Players who forgot to check their plants found them withered. Players who tended them regularly found supplies building gradually over the course of their time in Hoenn. The rhythm of this system quietly taught something about patience and return, the same lesson embedded in the old man watching from Mirage Island. The Battle Frontier, introduced in the third game of the generation, was Hoenn's most complex optional region, a facility dedicated entirely to competitive challenge. It contains 7 different battle formats, each governed by a brain, a trainer of exceptional ability, who waited at the end of a streak of consecutive victories. The Battle Tower was the most straightforward of these facilities, a format carried forward from the previous generation and familiar in its structure. But the Battle Factory introduced something genuinely new: rental Pokémon. Players entered the factory without their own partners, choosing instead from a random pool of available creatures and building teams on the fly. This format removed the advantage of months of preparation and replaced it with quick judgment and adaptability. The Battle Pyramid was perhaps the most unusual of the 7. It was a dark structure where players navigated floor by floor without a map, finding items and avoiding trainers while the floor's visual clarity gradually declined. By the upper floors, the screen was nearly black, navigation became memory, and the challenge was as much about composure as combat. The facility felt like it was testing something beyond competitive strategy. The brains of the Battle Frontier became figures of considerable legend among players who pursued them seriously. They were not presented dramatically. They did not give speeches or make threats. They simply waited at the end of very long streaks and then played exceptionally well. Their quiet competence was more intimidating than any amount of theatrical villainy would have been. The music of Hoenn contained mysteries of its own. The soundtrack drew from a wider range of instrumentation than previous generations, incorporating elements that felt at once tropical and melancholic, bright and ancient. The theme that played in the Regis chambers was sparse and unsettling, a few notes repeating with long silences between them. It felt like music designed for a space where time moved differently. The Route 119 theme, which accompanied exploration of the rainy route connecting several key locations, had a wistfulness embedded in its melody that many players could not articulate but could feel. It sounded like the end of something, like an afternoon becoming evening, like a journey reaching the point where you could see the destination but had not yet arrived. It became one of the most discussed pieces of Pokémon music among fans who had grown up with the game. The Pokemon Center theme in Hoenn was warmer than those in previous generations, a familiar melody given a slightly different orchestration that made each entry into a center feel briefly like coming home after a long walk. The designers understood that music functions as emotional architecture, and they built the spaces of Hoenn to feel inhabited and alive through sound as much as through visual design. Mount Pyre held perhaps the most affecting music in the region. The mountain was a cemetery, a place where Pokemon were laid to rest, and the theme that played there was slow and deliberately muted. It did not try to be frightening. It tried to be respectful, and it succeeded. Players who visited Mount Pyre often became quieter in their engagement with the game, moving more carefully through the landscape, as though aware that the place asked something of them. Mount Pyre itself deserved more attention than it often received. It was a place of mourning built into the middle of a Pokemon adventure, and it took its purpose seriously without making it heavy. The elderly couple who guarded the red and blue orbs at the summit were presented as keepers of something that had been maintained for generations, custodians of ancient objects that most people had forgotten needed keeping. When the orbs were stolen, the couple's distress was not theatrical. They had failed at something they had spent their lives doing carefully. That specific kind of grief, the grief of someone who took quiet responsibility seriously and then watched it slip away despite their care, was communicated through very few words and landed with more weight than a longer scene might have managed. The graves on the lower slopes of Mount Pyre had no names on them. They were simple markers, and the game did not specify whether they honored Pokemon or people or both. This ambiguity made the cemetery feel genuinely old, the kind of place where the identities of those remembered had become less important than the act of remembering itself. Walking among those markers was a quiet moment, in an adventure that did not demand quiet moments often. The magma hideout carved deep into the volcanic rock of Jagged Pass was a location that felt lived in by people who had convinced themselves of something very specific. Team Magma believed that expanding the landmass of the world would benefit both Pokemon and humans by creating more habitat, more territory, more of the dry ground they associated with civilization. Their reasoning was not irrational, given their premises. Their premises were simply wrong in ways that their certainty made impossible to examine. The Aqua hideout beneath the waters, near Lily Cove, occupied the same structural role for the opposing organization. Team Aqua had decided that expanding the oceans would restore the world to a state more natural and more beautiful, that the excess of land was a recent and unfortunate development that could be corrected. So they were right that the world had once been different. They were catastrophically wrong about whether their intervention would improve it. What made both organizations interesting as villains was that they were not trying to rule the world or accumulate personal power in any simple sense. They had ideas about what the world should look like and were willing to cause significant harm in service of those ideas. The sincerity of their wrongness made them more compelling than straightforwardly selfish antagonists would have been. The moment when either organization activated the legendary Pokemon connected to their ideology and then immediately lost control of it was the story's most honest admission that good intentions and terrible judgment produce the same outcomes as malice. The creatures they had called could not be reasoned with, could not be appealed to, could not be told that the plan had worked well enough and now should stop. The consequences of the activation were indifferent to the intentions that had driven it. Absol arrived in Hoenn with a reputation it had done nothing to deserve. It appeared in areas affected by natural disasters or before they occurred, and this proximity had led the people who encountered it to conclude that it caused what it only ever witnessed. It was a disaster-sensing creature that tried to warn rather than harm, and the warning was consistently mistaken for the threat. The design of Absol communicated this misunderstanding through its appearance. It was white, which carried associations of purity or warning depending on cultural context, and it carried a curved horn that suggested precision rather than aggression. Its face was calm rather than menacing, but it was also clearly not a creature that most people would run toward happily, and in a world where encountering a rare creature near a catastrophe was a person's only data point, the interpretation that followed made a terrible kind of sense. Players who sought Absol on Route 120 found it in the tall grass as a moderately rare encounter, and the act of catching it was simpler than its reputation suggested it would be. Taking it onto a team meant carrying a creature with very high attack power and fragile defenses, a glass cannon with excellent offensive presence and limited ability to absorb punishment. There was something appropriate about that stat distribution for a creature whose role had always been to arrive, deliver an urgent message, and then leave before the situation became worse. Its later form, introduced in a subsequent generation, gave it wings made of crystallized darkness that extended from its head. This addition transformed the warning creature into something even more dramatic, but many players who had grown up with the original felt that the simpler form carried more mystery. A creature that simply appeared before things went wrong, without explanation or ceremony, asked questions that a winged upgrade made easier to categorize, and therefore less interesting. Tropius drifted through the tall grass of certain routes in the southern part of the region, a long-necked dinosaur creature with wings made of leaves and fruit growing from its chin. Its design was cheerful and unhurried, suggesting a creature that had been living this way for a very long time and saw no reason to change any of it. The leaves that formed its wings were large enough to provide shade, and the fruit at its chin was said to grow twice a year in warmer climates. Tropius was not a powerful battler, and it was not connected to any significant myth or mystery. Its presence in Hoenn was not about secrets. It was about the pleasure of finding something charming in an unexpected place, a large, gentle, fruit-bearing dinosaur wandering through the same routes where trainers with competitive intentions were hurrying toward their next gym badge. Its existence asked no questions. It simply was, and that sufficiency was its own kind of statement. The creature occupied a design space that Hoenn explored thoughtfully across many of its Pokémon, the intersection of prehistoric imagery and tropical warmth. Hoenn felt like a region where time had moved at a different pace in certain pockets, and Tropius reinforced that quality without ever needing to be connected to a ruin or a legendary or an unexplained phenomenon. Relicanth was found in underwater grass, accessible only through the diving mechanic, and its design was based directly on the coelacanth, a real-world fish once believed extinct and then discovered living in deep ocean environments in the 20th century. The coelacanth's rediscovery was one of the more dramatic moments in modern natural history, and the Pokémon drawn from it carried that quality of something old, surviving in a world that had moved on without it. Its typing of water and rock was unusual, and its stat distribution emphasized physical defense in ways that made it unexpectedly durable. More importantly, it was one of 2 Pokémon required to unlock the Regis chambers. The Braille inscription at the entrance of the sealed chamber demanded the player have both Wailord and Relicanth in specific positions in the party, and the specificity of this requirement was never explained. Why these 2 creatures? Why these positions? The implicit answer, constructed from the available imagery, was that the ancient civilization had wanted to ensure that whoever opened the chambers had engaged deeply enough with Hoenn's ocean to find a creature from the deep water and to have caught one of the largest creatures in the sea. It was a measure of familiarity with the underwater world rather than a test of strength. The puzzle rewarded exploration over power. Wailord, the other required creature, was enormous in a way that the game's visual representation could not fully convey. Its Pokedex entry described a body roughly 14 meters long, making it one of the largest creatures ever entered into the regional catalog. Its whale like design was gentle and unhurried, its enormous size made charming by an expression of mild contentment. It was the largest creature most players ever added to their team, and it floated in the water with the serene confidence of something that had no natural predators. The Hoenn region's connection to the sky took a form beyond Rayquaza and beyond the weather mechanics. The Moss Deep Space Center sat on the eastern island of the region and represented an unusual element in a world generally occupied with nature and ancient myth. Science operated in Hoenn, and the Space Center was its most visible expression, a facility dedicated to sending rockets beyond the atmosphere of the planet. The rockets launched from Moss Deep carried implications that the game explored only gently. They suggested a world where humanity was reaching beyond its planet, where the sky that Rayquaza called home had already been pierced by human technology. The relationship between this scientific ambition and the ancient forces that governed the same sky was never made explicit, but the proximity of the two was clearly intentional. The Space Center was also the location of one of the gym leaders, a pair of psychic-type specialists who trained together and battled in double battles rather than singles. This format, two leaders against two Pokémon simultaneously, felt appropriate for a facility dedicated to precision and coordination. The science and the battling existed in the same building without contradiction, each informed by the same qualities of careful attention and collaborative effort. Meteor Falls was a cave that connected the western roots of Hoenn and housed one of the more visually distinctive environments in the region. Waterfalls ran through it, and the rocks of its walls were embedded with small glowing points that the game identified as meteorites. The falls themselves created a constant low sound that made the space feel enclosed and ancient, a place where water had been moving through rock for longer than anyone had been counting. The Bagon that lived in the deepest rooms of Meteor Falls was another example of Hoenn's approach to connecting creature biology to location. Bagon was a small dragon-type creature that dreamed of flying and practiced by throwing itself off high places, its hard skull protecting it from the impacts of 100 failed attempts. It lived at the bottom of a waterfall cave, as far from the sky as a land-bound creature could be, and it was working towards something that its current body could not accomplish, but its evolved form eventually would. The persistence embedded in Bagon's design was communicated through its Pokedex entries rather than through any in-game scene, but players who read those entries and then spent time in Meteor Falls with the creature understood something about the nature of wanting very specific things and continuing toward them, despite the distance between current reality and the desired state. The falls fell around it, and it kept trying. Meteor Falls was also where players first encountered Zinnia in later revisitations of the story, a character whose own relationship with the region's mythological history was layered and complex. But in the original games, the location was simply a beautiful and slightly mysterious cave, and the mystery was enough. The Laveridge Town Hot Springs sat at the base of Mount Chimney and offered one of the game's most atmospheric resting locations. The steam rising from the outdoor pools in the visible environment created a sense of warmth and rest that the nearby volcanic activity gave a slightly unsettling edge. The town existed because the mountain was hot, and the hot mountain was also dangerous, and the residents of Laveridge had decided that the safest relationship with danger was proximity managed carefully. The pharmacy in Laveridge sold a lava cookie, a regional treat that functioned as a healing item, but also existed as a piece of cultural world-building. People in Laveridge baked things using volcanic heat. They had domesticated their proximity to something that could have been only threatening and turned it into something that could also be delicious. This small detail A cookie sold in a volcano town said something quiet and interesting about the people who chose to live there. The gym leader who presided over Laveridge was an elderly woman whose fire-type Pokémon included a Torkoal, a tortoise creature that burned coal inside its shell and expelled the smoke through holes in its body. The Torkoal's design implied an organism that had found a way to incorporate combustion into its biology, something that burned internally and controlled that burning carefully enough to remain functional. It was one of Hoenn's more unusual creature concepts, biology intersecting with something that normally existed outside of biology. The Pokemon contests that ran throughout Hoenn were organized around 5 categories of appeal, and the performances within them asked a different kind of attention from participants. In the appeals round, moves were performed in sequence before a panel of judges, and the order and combination of appeals produced different effects depending on how they interacted with what had come before. Some appeals worked best as openers. Some improved when placed after a nervous performance by another contestant. Some raised attention from the crowd, while others were designed to lower it. The strategy embedded in contests was as intricate as battle strategy, but oriented entirely differently. Where battles rewarded damage output and survival, contests rewarded timing, combination, and an understanding of how an audience responds to sequence and variety. Players who took contests seriously developed a different relationship with their Pokemon's movesets, seeing each move not as a tool for dealing damage, but as a performance element with its own emotional weight. The connection between move selection and artistic expression was never more visible than in contests, and players who engaged with both battle and contest formats came away with a more complete understanding of what each of their Pokemon was capable of communicating. A move that seemed redundant in battle might anchor an entire contest strategy. A Pokemon otherwise overlooked might be spectacular under specific contest conditions. The ribbons earned through contest success could be applied to Pokemon and carried forward, becoming part of the permanent record of what that creature had accomplished. This made contest participation feel meaningful in a way that casual players might have missed. A quiet alternative history of achievement running alongside the gym badge narrative. The battle tent facilities scattered across Hoenn offered smaller-scale competitive experiences available before the full battle frontier. They were hosted inside large tents in various towns and offered formats that rotated, introducing players to different rule sets gradually. One format required players to use rental Pokemon. Another allowed them to bet Pokemon temporarily. A third scrambled the movesets of the player's own team. The scrambled moves format was particularly disorienting for players accustomed to knowing exactly what each of their Pokemon could do. Walking into a battle with familiar creatures who suddenly had unfamiliar moves forced a kind of creative improvisation that the main game rarely required. Players who thrived under those conditions discovered something about their own adaptability that straightforward battles did not reveal. The tents were not permanent buildings. They were temporary structures, implying a traveling competitive circuit that moved through Hoenn's towns and set up wherever space allowed. This impermanence gave them a different quality from the permanent gyms, less institutional and more alive, part of a culture of competitive battling that existed outside the formal badge collection structure. The volcanic landscape around Laveridge extended into Fiery Path, a short cave whose name made its contents obvious and whose atmosphere delivered exactly the sense of mild underground heat and orange-tinted light that the name promised. Torkoal appeared here in greater numbers than almost anywhere else, their coal-fueled shells filling the cramped space with a faint haze. The cave was not long or complex, but it felt genuinely warm in a way that read as specific rather than generic. This kind of small, atmospheric location was one of Hoenn's consistent strengths. Not every area in the region needed to be monumental or mysterious. Some were simply places that felt convincingly like themselves, environments where the physical and biological logic connected in ways that made you believe in the world, even though the world was made of pixels and rules. The route between Lavaridge and the rest of the region climbed and descended through mountain terrain that the bicycle made manageable, but which rewarded slower exploration on foot. Berry trees appeared in pockets of soil between rock formations, and the rhythm of checking them, noting which had ripened and which needed more time, established the kind of ongoing relationship with the landscape that made traversal feel purposeful rather than transitional. The Berrymaster's house along Route 123 was one of those quiet, recurring pleasures that rewarded regular visits without demanding them. The old man inside gave berries away each day to players who visited, and his wife offered additional ones in exchange for correctly recalling phrases connected to in-game events. This second system was subtle enough that many players never engaged with it, but those who did discovered that the couple's quiet life of growing and distributing berries was a small world in itself, organized and warm and indifferent to the larger conflicts happening elsewhere in the region. This quality of domestic routines continuing undisturbed while something dramatic happened nearby appeared in several locations throughout Hoenn. People in small towns went about their business. Fishermen stood at their spots. Collectors arranged their collections. The world did not pause for the player's story, and that continued activity in the background gave the region a texture of genuine coexistence rather than theatrical staging. The berries themselves were part of a network of systems reaching from the Berrymaster's house to contest halls to the deep water where Phoebus waited, and through competitive team building and into the chemistry of Pokeblock making and back out into the rhythms of daily agricultural maintenance. No single explanation connected all of these systems. The player assembled the connections slowly, the way you come to understand a community by spending time in it rather than by reading a guide. Slateport City held a museum that most players visited for functional reasons, but which offered more than its immediate purpose suggested. The Pokémon fan club, the museum's displays, the market on the beach, and the shipyard all occupied the same coastal town, creating a place that felt genuinely busy in the way that port cities feel busy. Multiple things happening simultaneously, each connected to the others by proximity and trade. The museum contained exhibits about the ocean and about Pokémon, and a man inside connected the two, explaining his research into the behavior of specific aquatic creatures with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had found something worth finding and wanted everyone to hear about it. This was a recurring character type in Hoenn, the expert who appeared in an unexpected location and offered information without being asked, because they had decided that sharing what they knew was worth the time of anyone willing to listen. The market in Slateport sold items and decorations and attracted a rotating collection of buyers and sellers who added ambient activity to the city's waterfront. Among them were occasionally people connected to the competitive circuit, collectors of specific items, or trainers with unusual teams that didn't fit any obvious template. The city felt like it was part of a larger economy that extended beyond what the player could directly see. The long sea routes between Hoenn's islands were another of the region's defining characteristics. Sailing between land masses across open water gave the region a spatial quality different from any previous setting. The ocean was not a barrier to be crossed and forgotten, but a recurring environment with its own inhabitants, its own weather effects, and its own rhythm. Routes 124 and 126 felt genuinely oceanic, places where the land was temporarily absent and the only direction was forward. The creatures encountered on these routes occupied a range of visual metaphors for deep-sea life. Tentacool and Tentacruel represented the jellyfish family with their translucent, trailing designs. Wingle glided on the surface wind as the region's most abundant avian presence. Sharpdo cut through the water with an aggression that its design communicated instantly, the forward-angled shape of its body suggesting momentum rather than rest, and Whalmer bobbed with the gentle buoyancy of something that was mostly water itself. The underwater routes accessible through diving added an additional layer to this ocean exploration. The seabed had its own terrain, covered in seagrass and scattered with the occasional artifact or item. The creatures encountered while diving were different from those above, slower and more sedentary, accustomed to a world where light arrived filtered and muted rather than direct and bright. Moving between the surface routes and the underwater ones created a sense of genuine depth, a world below the world that operated by slightly different rules. The abandoned ship that drifted on the sea routes was not the only vessel in Hoenn with history. The SS Tidal Ferry connected the region's major ports and operated with the reliable efficiency of a public transportation system that had decided not to draw attention to itself. It was simply there when you needed it, moving between Slateport and Lily Cove on a schedule that the game managed quietly in the background. The contrast between the functioning ferry and the drifting wreck created an implicit story about vessels and fates. One ship maintained its purpose, one had lost its purpose and drifted somewhere between usefulness and memory. The players who rode the SS Tidal regularly and also explored the abandoned ship experienced both without being asked to compare them, but the comparison existed in the design, whether or not it was consciously noticed. Lily Cove City, where the Tidal often docked, was the region's largest urban settlement and the one that felt most contemporary. It had a department store, a contest hall, a Cove Lily Motel, a museum with rotating displays, and a harbor that connected to the broader ocean. It was the place where the different currents of Hoenn's activities, battling, competing, collecting, trading, converged in the same physical space. The museum in Lily Cove displayed art, and the art was described but not shown in detail, leaving players to imagine what specific pieces contained without being able to examine them closely. This gap between description and visibility, the thing mentioned but not fully shown, was another example of the deliberate restraint that gave Hoenn's world the feeling of extending beyond the visible screen. The Devon Corporation in Rustboro occupied a prominent building and a prominent role in the early narrative, connecting the player to the broader plot through deliveries and encounters with a rival corporate culture. The company made Pokeballs, specifically the specialized varieties that required more sophisticated manufacturing than the standard model. The premier ball, given away as a bonus for buying 10 standard balls at once, was a subtle piece of commercial world building, a loyalty reward from a corporation operating within a fantasy economy. Devon also made the PokeNav, a device with early GPS functionality in a world that had navigated by landmarks and signposts in previous generations. The PokeNav's mapping function and opponent tracking features suggested a society in the process of technological transition, moving from analog navigation towards something more sophisticated without fully having arrived. The device worked, but it still required the player to read its outputs and make judgments that no algorithm could make for them. The connection between Devon and Team Magma, established early in the story, gave the corporate narrative a dimension it wouldn't otherwise have had. Industry and ideology intersected in Hoenn's story in ways that asked players to think about who benefits from specific visions of how the world should be structured, even if that thinking arrived obliquely through adventure game plot mechanics rather than explicit argument. The Granite Cave was Hoenn's first significant dungeon environment, reached through Dewford Town and occupied by Stephen Stone on the occasion of his initial encounter with the player. Stephen was Hoenn's champion, though this was not immediately apparent from the context of the meeting. He was simply a man collecting rare stones in a cave, interested in the Pokémon that the player had brought to show him more than he was interested in explaining his own position in the world. This quality of revealing important things obliquely was characteristic of how Hoenn handled its most significant characters. Stephen did not announce his status. His enthusiasm for rare minerals and his quiet competence in casual conversation were the only initial indicators that he occupied an unusual place in the region's hierarchy. Players who revisited the early encounters after reaching the championship understood the meeting differently, the way you sometimes reread a letter once you know how the story ended. Brawley, the gym leader of Dewford, occupied a similar role in the narrative of understatement. He surfed. He trained in darkness. He built his fighting type gym on an island town that attracted people who wanted exactly the kind of isolated, focused existence that the ocean creates around any island community. His low key presentation masked a gym leader whose battle mechanics were more complex than most players anticipated, and the gap between his relaxed appearance and his actual challenge was a small mystery that resolved itself through loss. The Pokemon that defined Hoenn's sky were diverse enough to feel like an actual ecosystem, rather than a list of aerial creatures assembled arbitrarily. Tailo and Swellow provided the quick, aggressive songbird energy. Swablu drifted with its cloud-like wings, creating a visual pun that was charming rather than merely clever. Wingle served the role of the common gull, present in oceanic contexts with the comfortable ubiquity of something that belongs everywhere. Altaria, the evolved form of Swablu, was unusual in its final typing. It became a dragon-type Pokemon, despite looking like nothing that suggested draconic energy. Its entire body wrapped in cloud cotton, and its disposition consistently gentle. The gap between appearance and typing created a pleasant cognitive dissonance. A creature that looked like it should be giving weather forecasts, but could instead learn dragon breath. Its later mega evolution built on this incongruity by adding more feathers and somehow becoming both softer and more powerful simultaneously. Pelipper commanded the coastal routes with the particular authority of large seabirds, its enormous bill capable of scooping things from the water with the same relaxed efficiency as its real-world inspiration. It served as Hoenn's major flying HM user in casual play, the creature most commonly called upon to carry players across the water and deliver them to the other shore. This functional role gave it an underappreciated centrality to the game's navigation, the creature whose usefulness was so quiet and consistent that it became easy to overlook. The hidden bases that players could carve into soft soil along various routes were one of Hoenn's most personalizing features. Using a specific item, players could create private spaces inside hillsides, under bridges, or in tree branches, and then decorate those spaces with furniture acquired through various means. The bases were small, but they were owned specific spaces in the shared world that belonged to the player who created them. This ownership carried a quality different from the rest of the game's engagement. Other players could visit your base and battle the team you had set there. You could mark bases you had found with flags, turning the collection of those flags into a secondary goal for players interested in the social dimension of the game. The bases were private spaces that the game had created mechanisms for sharing, a tension between interiority and community that the design managed with gentle sophistication. The furniture available for decorating ranged from purely aesthetic to functionally useful, with certain items enabling activities that couldn't be done anywhere else. A television screen, a poster, a small plush doll of a regional creature, these were all ways of asserting that the space had a character that was continuous with the person who had built it. Walking into a hidden base that another player had made and furnished told you something about them, even in the absence of any direct communication. Zigzagoon and its evolution, Linuoon occupied the early roots of Hoenn as the region's primary normal type early encounter, and they carried a peculiar hidden mechanic that became significant for players who understood it. Linoon could use the move pickup to collect items after battles, even if it hadn't used a move in that battle. At higher levels, the items it could find included rare consumables that would otherwise require significant effort or luck to obtain. This meant that a team of Linuune, brought along for no reason other than their passive collection ability, would quietly gather useful items across hundreds of battles while the player focused on other goals. The pickup ability was one of Hoenn's most rewarding secrets for players who discovered it, a passive system that worked in the background and revealed its benefits gradually. The creature itself was not powerful. Its usefulness was entirely architectural, a function built into its design that rewarded the kind of thinking that asked not only what a Pokemon could do in battle, but what it could do between battles. The black stripe that zigzagged across Zigzagoon's back was its most distinctive visual feature, and the one that gave it both its name and its characteristic running pattern. It moved in erratic paths across routes rather than straight lines, a behavior that gave it personality before any Pokédex entry was read. The running pattern was an expression of the creature's character, visible in its environment, rather than explained through text, and that kind of environmental character communication was something Hoenn did consistently well. Nincada's evolution was one of the generation's most unusual mechanical discoveries. When Nincada evolved into Ninjask, the shell it left behind could, under very specific conditions, become a second Pokemon called Shedinja. This required an empty slot in the player's party and a Pokeball in the bag, and when both conditions were met, the shed shell animated quietly and appeared in the team without fanfare. Shedinja had only one hit point, and its ability, Wonder Guard, made it immune to every type of attack that was not super effective against it. This made it functionally invulnerable against creatures that could not hit it with one of its type weaknesses, and completely fragile against any that could. It occupied a design space that was purely conceptual, a creature whose viability depended entirely on what it was fighting and whose existence was a surprise that the game had never explicitly promised. The lore attached to Shedinja was equally unusual. Its empty shell was said to harbor a spirit that had been captured when Nincada's shell was shed, and looking into the void inside it was described as dangerous for reasons the game did not specify. This ambient horror, delivered through a Pokédex entry for a creature that most players encountered by accident, was another example of Hoenn's approach to darkness. Present in small doses, delivered quietly, and left without resolution. Ralts appeared on Route 102 at extremely low encounter rates in the early game, and many players who heard about it from other sources spent hours in the tall grass looking for one without finding it. Its appearance was small and soft, its green head covering suggesting a bonnet, and its emotional sensitivity suggesting a creature that experienced the world very differently from the armor-plated or combative creatures that surrounded it. The Ralt's evolutionary line built toward Gardevoir, a design that communicated elegance and emotional depth in equal measure. Gardevoir's Pokédex entries described a creature that would use its power to collapse space itself in order to protect a trainer it cared for, the kind of loyalty that transcended strategic utility and spoke to a relationship between trainer and Pokémon that the game's central theme had always been trying to articulate. The mechanics of training and battling were one language. Gardevoir's lore was the same truth in a different one. A male alternative evolution path to Galad was introduced in a later generation, giving the Ralt's line a branching structure that retroactively added depth to the original design. But in Hoenn's original telling, Ralts led only to Gardevoir, and the emotional arc of finding a rare, sensitive creature and nurturing it towards something formidable and devoted was complete in itself. Chimecho drifted through the summit of Mount Pyre in the original games, its small body connecting to a cloud pattern above through a curling tendril. the whole design resembling a wind chime caught in a permanent gentle motion. It was rare enough that many players who knew of it spent significant time searching Mount Pyre specifically to find one. It was psychic type, pale and quiet, and its Pokedex entries described it producing sounds that could be either healing or unsettling depending on context. The wind chime design was one of Hoenn's more elegant pieces of creature concept work, taking an object associated with soft sound and still air and giving it independent movement and emotional resonance. Chimico was not powerful in battle, and its rarity was not proportional to any competitive value it provided. It was rare because it occupied a specific ecological niche, and that niche happened to be at the top of the region's cemetery mountain, which gave finding one a quality that purely functional designs could not replicate. Players who wanted Chimecho on their teams often built those teams around it despite its limitations, precisely because the effort of finding it had created an attachment that purely practical team building decisions would never have generated. The difficulty of acquisition and the creature's quiet character combined to make it meaningful in a way that bypassed competitive logic entirely. The sealed chamber hidden en Route 134 was the necessary precursor to reaching any of the Reggie trio, and finding it required knowing that diving in a specific location would lead to something the map did not mark. Inside the chamber, the Braille inscriptions explained both what needed to be done and which creatures needed to be brought along, but the chamber's own purpose, the civilization that had created it, the reasons for sealing the Regis in the first place, were left entirely without explanation. The sealed chamber was itself sealed when players first found it, the secondary inscription only becoming readable and usable after the primary instruction had been followed. This layered unlocking, one discovery revealing the mechanism for the next discovery, created a sense of genuine archaeological process. The player was not being given a key. They were being given the ability to read a key that had been there all along. What the sealed chamber communicated most powerfully was the idea of a civilization organized around preservation. The people who had built it had thought not only about the present, but about a future they would not see, about who might eventually come to this place and what that person would need to know. They had written their instructions in a real alphabet that could still be read, and they had designed the unlocking process to require qualities they valued. This was planning on a geological timescale, and the quiet grandeur of that ambition was delivered through a small, water-filled room with words on the walls. The Weather Institute en Route 119 served a practical plot function, but also communicated something about Hoenn's relationship with its own climate. A facility dedicated to observing and understanding weather patterns was necessary in a region where weather had mythological significance, where the conflict between ancient forces could manifest as catastrophic precipitation or oppressive drought. The scientists inside were trying to understand the same forces that the legendary Pokémon embodied, using instruments and observation where the ancient civilization had used seals and Braille. After the main story forced a confrontation with the Institute, it settled back into its quiet scientific function, and players who returned found the researchers at their work again, as though the intervention of legendary scale forces had been professionally interesting rather than personally terrifying. This resilience was characteristic of Hoenn's background characters, people who had decided to do specific things in specific places and who continued doing them regardless of what the foreground narrative was producing. The rain on Route 119 was consistent, applied through the game's weather system in a way that made traversal feel genuinely damp and persistent. The tall grass in the rain, with the visibility slightly reduced and the color palette shifted toward grays and greens, created an atmosphere that was not quite beautiful and not quite unpleasant, the specific quality of a rainy afternoon that has been going on long enough to become the default condition rather than an interruption. Castform was the Weather Institute's resident research Pokémon, a small cloud-like creature whose appearance changed depending on the current weather conditions. In sunshine, it became a fiery red form. In rain, it became a blue teardrop. In hail, it became a white snowball. In neutral weather, it was a small gray sphere with a face, the simplest version of itself, the form that had no specific claim on the sky. The design concept was elegant in its directness, a creature that was literally shaped by its environment, that wore its weather on its body as both costume and communication, was a living weather forecast and a piece of conceptual art simultaneously. Its battle utility was modest, its typing ordinary, and its stats unremarkable. But it was one of the most purely conceptual creatures in the generation, an idea about the relationship between organism and environment expressed entirely through visual transformation. Players who battled Castform in different weather conditions discovered that its attacks changed along with its appearance. Fire moves in sun, water moves in rain, ice moves in hail. The creature was completely present in whatever conditions surrounded it, a quality that made it philosophically interesting, even if it never quite became strategically dominant. There was something appealing about a creature that had given up the pretense of having a fixed self that was always entirely its current context. Kecleon waited on specific routes, behind a ranger who could not be avoided, and the challenge of defeating the creature with its ability to shift its type to match the last move used against it was one of Hoenn's more specific mechanical puzzles. Its chameleon inspiration was expressed both in the type-shifting mechanic and in its zigzag stripe pattern, which it could not change even when the rest of its body rendered invisible. The stripe was always there, always the same color, the one thing that could not adapt. This permanent feature within an otherwise perfectly adaptable creature was either an oversight of mimicry or a deliberate biological limitation, and the game never specified which interpretation was correct. But the image of a creature that could become invisible from head to toe, except for one consistent, unchangeable stripe, spoke to something true about identity. Even perfect adaptation has its fixed points. The Kecleon shops in a later game would lean into this connection between the creature and commerce, its ability to offer things of varying value, echoing the chameleon's ability to offer varying appearances. But in Hoenn's original telling, Kecleon was simply a creature on the road, available to catch, carrying its single unchangeable stripe through a life of perfect flexibility. The Trickmaster's final challenge, available only after the Elite Four had been defeated, introduced a puzzle that felt genuinely different from its predecessors. The sense that the puzzles had been building towards something, that the Trickmaster's enthusiasm for challenging visitors was connected to an ongoing project of his own creative expression, gave the final completion a different weight from simply clearing one more puzzle room. The reward at the end was useful, but not extraordinary. The experience of reaching it, however, having returned multiple times across the span of the game and engaged with the man's changing enthusiasms, created a relationship with the location that no single visit could have established. The Trick House was one of Hoenn's most complete examples of a thing that rewarded time rather than intensity. You could not rush through it. It waited for you to be ready. The Elite Four of Hoenn were arranged in a sequence that moved through Poison, Dark, Ghost, and Dragon before reaching the champion's room, and each of the four represented a different approach to the aesthetics of their type. Sydney's casual confidence made Dark type feel conversational rather than threatening. Phoebe's warmth around Ghost type Pokémon made the category feel inhabited by personality rather than emptiness. Glacia's precise composure with Ice type suggested discipline rather than coldness. Drake's Dragon-type specialization carried the weight of someone who had spent a long time with creatures that were genuinely difficult, and the patience that required had become visible in his manner. Stephen waited beyond all of them, and his steel and psychic team was the culmination of everything the player had been building toward, across the long route system, and the water crossings, and the cave explorations, and the badge collection, and the gradual incremental growth that the game's structure had been facilitating from the beginning. His aesthetic was geological in the best sense, careful, layered, ancient in its influences, assembled from materials that lasted. The champion's room in Hoenn had a particular quality in the games that placed the encounter after a long journey through the Victory Road's narrow passages. By the time the player arrived, the team that had carried them there was the result of every choice made along the way, and facing Stephen was facing a reflection of all of those choices organized into a challenge that asked whether they had been good ones. The post-game world of Hoenn opened after the champion's defeat and revealed a region that continued past the boundaries of the main story. The battle frontier appeared on an island not previously accessible, and the southern island offered its legendary encounter. The Pokémon that had been legendarily rare during the main journey became available through specific conditions or through continued exploration of areas that now held different creatures in different places. The caves of Meteor Falls, revisited after the story had concluded, offered late-game encounters and the satisfaction of returning to an earlier place with a stronger team and a different understanding of what the journey had been. Routes that had been traversed quickly while pursuing the next badge reward slower exploration with the kind of unhurried attention that the main narrative's momentum had discouraged. This quality of the world continuing after the narrative concluded was one of the defining features of the Pokémon franchise, and Hoenn's postgame felt particularly rich because the region's mysteries were numerous enough that completing the main story left many threads still unresolved. The Regis chambers were accessible but optional. Mirage Island still appeared, or didn't appear according to its own invisible logic. The old man in Pacifid Log still looked east every day. Latias and Lados moved through the post-game world on their separate trajectories, reachable only through careful tracking with the PokeNav's match call function, which could narrow down which route a roaming Pokémon currently occupied. The chase involved entering and exiting routes until the creature appeared, and the moment of encountering it, after potentially hours of narrowing the search, was one of the game's most adrenaline-adjacent experiences. The creature was there, it was running, and you had one chance to handle the situation well. The Eon ticket, distributed through real-world events and mystery gift mechanics, allowed access to the southern island, where the second member of the twin pair waited without the complication of a chase. This direct encounter was calmer, more formal, the creature simply present in its island home and available for engagement without the pursuit. Both modes of encounter, the chase and the formal meeting, said something different about the relationship between the player and these particular Pokémon. The film that expanded the lore of the twins was set in a city called Alto Mare that did not exist in the games, a place of canals and water taxis that had its own history with Latios and Latias, and a tragedy that had occurred there, which the story revealed carefully rather than all at once. Players who came to the games through the film and players who came to the film through the games carried different versions of what these creatures meant, and the two versions enriched each other without requiring synthesis. The nature system, introduced in this generation, assigned a fixed personality trait to each Pokémon that influenced its stat growth, making two creatures of the same species, raised under identical conditions, produce different numerical results based on the hidden quality they had been assigned at their moment of creation. This system added a layer of identity beneath the visible surface of each Pokémon, something true about them that was not visible but was always operative. Players who engaged deeply with this system learned to prefer certain natures for certain creatures, trading and breeding to find combinations of nature and stat spread that matched their strategic preferences. But the system's most interesting quality was not competitive. It was philosophical. Every Pokemon had a nature, and that nature was fixed, and it shaped the creature's growth in ways that the player had not chosen and could not change. The creature was, in some sense, already itself from the moment it appeared, and the player's role was to understand that fixed self and work with it rather than imposing an alternative. This idea that each creature had something inherent and particular rather than being a blank slate waiting to be shaped entirely by external input ran through Hoenn's design in several directions. The creatures native to specific environments, the sealed Regis, the roaming twins, the deepwater relicanth, all of them existed on their own terms and asked the player to engage with them on those terms rather than expecting them to conform to expectations. The contest ribbons collected by dedicated participants accumulated on Pokemon over time, creating a record of achievement that was both visible and personal. A Pokemon with a full set of Contest Master ribbons in every category had a history of successful performance that the game documented without narrating. The ribbons did not tell the story of how each contest had been won, only that it had been. The story belonged to the player's memory. This approach to achievement documentation, marking that something had happened without describing how, was consistent with Hoenn's broader relationship with information. The region withheld explanations frequently and generously, trusting players to construct meaning from the traces left, rather than needing the meaning provided in advance. The ribbons were traces, the Braille inscriptions were traces. The old man's vigil in Passvidlog was a trace of a decades-long wait. Hoenn was built from things that implied more than they showed. The show of this approach reached its clearest expression in the things that were never explained at all. Who built the sealed chamber? Why the Regis were created? What happened on the SS Cactus? Where Mirage Island went when it disappeared? And what the ancient civilization of Hoenn believed about the forces they had taken the trouble to contain. These were not oversights. They were the deliberate construction of a space where imagination had room to work. The Hoenn region, explored fully and slowly, was a place where the world extended past what could be seen, where creatures and locations carried implications that were never made explicit, and where the act of wandering without a specific destination often revealed more than following the main road had. Its mysteries were not puzzles with correct solutions, but questions with productive uncertainties, invitations to wonder rather than challenges to overcome. The creatures that lived here were as varied as the terrain that housed them, from the ancient sealed stone of the Regis trio to the gentle drift of Chimecho above the graves of Mount Pyre, from the deep-water stillness of Relicanth on the seafloor to the high-altitude serenity of Rayquaza above the ozone layer. The world was layered, and the layering was the point. Those who played slowly, who fished every tile of the river looking for a creature that might not be there today, who returned to the trick house one more time with a new badge, who stood in Passifidlog looking east because an old man had decided that looking was worthwhile. Those players were doing something the region had been designed to reward, not rushing toward completion, but inhabiting a world that had been built to be inhabited. The mysteries of Hoenn do not resolve tonight. They remain where they have always been, in the code and the quiet and the corners of a world that was built with more care than any single visit could fully appreciate. Let them rest where they are, and let the not knowing be its own kind of peace. And if you find yourself returning to this place again sometime, the old man will still be looking east, and Mirage Island may or may not be visible, and Phoebus will be waiting somewhere in the rain-gray water for whoever comes next, with the patience to look carefully enough. Thanks for drifting here tonight. The landscape of Hoenn held details that rewarded the kind of attention most players reserved for things that demanded it. Certain trees could be headbutted and would produce specific creatures depending on the location of the tree and the time of day. Certain patches of ash deposited by the ongoing activity of Mount Chimney's crater could be swept into specific items if the player arrived with a Pokemon that knew the correct field move. These were systems that operated according to logic that the game never explicitly taught, rewarding the player who approached the world with curiosity rather than the player who followed instructions. The ash route that wound along the eastern slope of the volcano was visually distinctive, its gray-white coating setting it apart from the green roots that surrounded it. The ash fell continuously, suggesting an eruption that was ongoing rather than concluded, and the creatures in the tall grass there were different from those elsewhere, adapted to the specific conditions of a world dusted with volcanic output. The design of the route communicated something about how ecosystems form around even the most hostile conditions, finding equilibrium where an observer might expect only emptiness. The glass workshop near the ash root could take the collected material and produce useful items from it, completing a loop that connected volcanic activity to biological adaptation to human craft to practical reward. This kind of chain, where the world's own processes generated resources that moved through different hands before becoming something useful, was part of how Hoenn created the feeling of an economy rather than a set of locations housing isolated features. The Safari Zone's warden carried something of his own mystery beneath the practical structure of his daily routine. He had created a set of conditions for accessing his preserve and had maintained those conditions with a consistency that implied genuine commitment to a philosophy about how nature should be approached. The slow accumulation of access, one area at a time, one counted walk at a time, was his argument made behavioral rather than verbal. You should earn your way into the wild, and earning it means returning, and returning means that the place becomes familiar, and familiarity becomes care. The creatures available in the deepest sections of the Safari Zone included some that appeared nowhere else in Hoenn, which gave the Warden's slow system a dual purpose. It protected the preserve from the purely transactional visitor while ensuring that the rarest things within it required the most sustained relationship with the place before they could be found. The design of access and rarity were connected, each reinforcing the other's logic. Walking through the Safari Zone's different terrains, from the open grassy areas near the entrance to the water sections and the denser growth deeper in, produced the sense of moving through zones of increasing wildness. The areas closest to the entrance felt managed. The areas farthest in felt genuinely separate from the human world, accessible only because someone had decided that access, carefully structured, was possible. The double battle mechanic that Hoenn introduced changed how players thought about their teams at a level below conscious strategy. Where previous games had been organized around the individual Pokémon as the unit of action, double battles made the pair the unit, and the relationship between the two creatures on the field at any moment became as important as the capabilities of either one alone. Moves that spread damage to both opponents rewarded offensive pressure. Moves that protected one ally while the other attacked created defensive layers. Moves that drew attacks toward a specific target allowed the player to control which of their creatures absorbed incoming damage. This architecture of cooperation required players to think about pairs of Pokémon in terms of what each one enabled for the other, a relational logic that built on the central theme of partnership in ways that single battles could only approach. The in-game trainers who used double battles were often more interesting to fight than those using singles, because their pairs were chosen with an eye toward interaction. Weather-setting Pokémon were often paired with creatures that benefited from the resulting condition. Physical walls were paired with sweepers that needed a time to set up. Hazard setters appeared alongside creatures built to capitalize on the damage those hazards produced. The strategy visible in NPC teams told stories about how the designers thought about each creature's role within a pair, and those stories were as interesting as any explicit narrative. The Hoenn Pokédex contained 202 entries across the original games, a number that felt both comprehensive and curated. Not every ecological niche was filled, which gave the region a sense of deliberate selection rather than systematic completion. Some creature categories appeared once, where previous regions had offered multiple options. Some categories were represented more densely than players accustomed to earlier games might have expected. The design of the Hoenn Pokédex rewarded players who came to it without preconceptions from previous regions. Creatures that filled familiar roles looked different and behaved differently because the tropical, oceanic environment they had been built for operated by different rules. The electric type encounter that dominated early routes in Kanto and Johto was absent from Hoenn's early routes, replaced by electric further into the journey. The ghost types appeared earlier and were stranger. The fighting types carried different aesthetic references. Reading the Pokédex entries of Hoenn's creatures was one of the quieter pleasures the game offered. The entries described behaviors, habitats, and qualities in a terse factual register that occasionally revealed something genuinely unusual. The entry that described a creature's behavior would sometimes imply an entire ecological relationship in two sentences, a predator-prey dynamic, or a symbiosis, or an adaptation to a specific pressures that existed nowhere else in the region's world. These implications were never followed up. They simply rested in the data available to anyone who looked. Nosepass stood on Route 114 with its nose pointing reliably north, a permanent compass made of stone that oriented itself using the geomagnetic field in a way that was described as a reflex rather than a choice. This quality of involuntary orientation, of having a direction built into your biology that you could not turn off, was one of the more philosophically interesting concepts in Hoenn's creature roster, though it arrived without fanfare in a route that many players passed through quickly on the way to somewhere else. The creature's design was block-like and Easter Island adjacent, the stone face with the enormous directional nose suggesting something ancient and unhurried. In battle, it was a physical wall with mediocre offensive capability, useful in specific contexts and otherwise overlooked. But the image of it standing in the tall grass of Route 114 with its nose pointing consistently north had an appealing quality to it, a creature that knew something simple and true and had arranged its entire body around that knowledge. Its evolution into Probopass would come in a later generation, adding magnetic mini-noses that orbited the central face and amplified the magnetic field theme into something more overtly mechanical. But in Hoenn's original telling, the simple compass creature stood in its grass and pointed north, and the simplicity of that was sufficient. The Pokémon breeding mechanics that operated throughout the series took on particular significance in Hoenn because of the connections those mechanics had to the mystery content of the region. Wenot, the baby form found on Mirage Island, could also be bred from Wobbuffet using a specific held item, and the knowledge of this alternate acquisition method circulated among players who had accepted that the island might never appear for them. There was always another way, though the other way required knowledge of a system that the game did not teach directly. Breeding also served as the mechanism for passing egg moves between generations of Pokémon, creating chains of inheritance that could extend across multiple breeding pairs before producing the desired combination of inherited techniques. This system allowed players to give creatures moves that their species could not naturally learn through leveling or technical machines, moves that the creature's ancestors had known and passed down through a biological memory that the game modeled as genetic inheritance. The philosophical implications of egg moves were never addressed within the game's fiction, but they were there for any player who thought about them. A Pokémon could hatch already knowing a technique that took its parent years to master, not because it had trained, but because the memory of having trained was somehow transmissible. This was one of the ways that the game's mechanics, taken seriously, rather than instrumentally, opened onto questions that the game's world could not fully contain. The Pokemon Contest Hall in Lily Cove was the largest and most formal of the contest venues, requiring players to have already won at all lower levels before attempting the Master Rank competitions. The rank structure of the contest circuit mirrored that of the gym circuit without ever directly intersecting it, a parallel progression through increasing formality and increasing difficulty that could consume as much time as the main journey but left entirely different kinds of achievements in its wake. The judges who evaluated contest performances were recurring characters present at every competition, their preferences and responses consistent enough that players who paid attention could develop a feel for what they rewarded. This consistency suggested an aesthetic philosophy, a set of values about what made a good performance good, that the game embodied in the mechanical outcomes without articulating in dialogue. Learning to please the judges was learning to understand their aesthetics, and understanding the aesthetics was learning to think about a Pokemon's moveset as a set of expressive choices rather than a collection of damage outputs. The fans that appeared in contest halls and applauded specific performances created ambient social context around the competition, suggesting an audience with preferences and histories with specific Pokemon and trainers. The contest circuit in Hoenn was not a solo achievement system, but a social event embedded in a community with its own ongoing relationships, and the player was entering that community from the outside and working toward recognition within it. The region's most isolated location was probably the faraway island, accessible only through a special ticket distributed at real-world events, and never available through ordinary play for most players in most regions. The island held Mew, the first generation's most mythologized creature, resting in a field of flowers at the end of a path through tall grass. Mew appeared as a pink, small, cat-like creature that turned away from direct approach and would flee repeatedly before a patient player could come close enough to encounter it. The approach to Mew required the player to move very slowly, staying within the grids where Mew was not currently looking, pausing when it turned to face the approaching trainer, and waiting for it to turn away again before advancing further. The mechanic was a hide-and-seek, a game within a game, built around the specific quality of approaching something that would flee from directness, but allowed patience. The metaphor embedded in the mechanic was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. Some things required you to move differently than you were accustomed to moving. The island itself was small, contained, and beautiful in the understated way of real-world meadow environments, and the creature that lived there, the mythological origin of all Pokemon according to one reading of the franchise's earliest lore, was spending its time in this meadow, turning away from observers who moved too quickly. There was a kind of wisdom in that, even if the game never said so. The journey through Hoenn's Victory Road was a final compression of everything the region had offered, a cave system that required strength, rock smash, surf, and various other movement tools in combination. Players who arrived at the Victory Road with the wrong configuration of tools could find themselves unable to progress, requiring a return to earlier routes for a creature that knew the correct move. The cave itself was not particularly long, but its requirement for flexibility rather than brute force made it a test of how completely the player had engaged with the region's systems rather than simply how powerful their team had become. The trainers inside Victory Road were the most capable random encounters in the game's main sequence, high-level teams using creatures and strategies that reflected serious engagement with the generation's mechanics. Battling them was different from battling trainers encountered earlier in the game, and the difference was not only numerical. The teams had more internal logic, more apparent intention. Someone had thought carefully about what these creatures could do together. Beyond the Victory Road's exit, the Pokemon League stood on a plateau that looked over the rest of the region. The view available from there, of the mountains and the ocean, and the distant shimmer of routes that had taken dozens of hours to traverse, was not something the game showed in a cinematic. It was simply there for players who looked at the available visual space and considered it. The region did not celebrate its own size, it simply had it. The quiet that Hoenn offered at its edges, in its most remote locations, and its most patient activities, was perhaps the most complete expression of what made it a particular kind of world. The games were adventures, organized around progress and discovery and the accumulation of strength and achievement. But Hoenn had been built with enough space in it that the adventure did not fill all of it. There were places to stand where nothing required your attention, locations where the visual design and the ambient sound created a quality of rest rather than urgency. The ocean on an empty route, early in the morning before any trainer had challenged you, moving slowly across the water with no destination in mind, was the kind of experience that the game made available without ever suggesting you should have it. The fishing mechanics worked just as well here as anywhere. The berry trees on the adjacent islands needed tending, and the air above the water was the same air where the roaming twins moved through the region on their unseen trajectories. This kind of quiet was what mysteries were finally for, not for the solving, but for the dwelling. The questions that Hoenn left open were not problems awaiting resolution, but spaces where your imagination could find a kind of rest that certainty could not provide. The sealed chamber was sealed and beautiful and unexplained, and the things sealed inside had been there long before you arrived, and would remain long after you were gone, and the old man on the floating logs would continue looking east into the distance, where Mirage Island sometimes appeared, and the willingness to look indefinitely at something that might not be there was itself the deepest mystery of all, and the most peaceful one. The stars above Moss Deep were the same stars visible from anywhere in Hoenn, but something about being on that eastern island, at the edge of the region where the ocean extended without interruption toward a horizon that held nothing visible, made them feel closer. Astronomers at the Space Center tracked objects beyond the atmosphere, and somewhere above everything, Rayquaza continued its long passage through the sky, aware of none of the things the humans below were pointing instruments toward. The route between Rustboro and Dewford carried a particular quality in the early hours of the game, before the player had assembled more than a handful of Pokémon, and before the broader shape of Hoenn had become clear. The path wound through stone tunnels and along cliff edges where the sea was visible below, and the trainers encountered along the way were young enough and honest enough in their enthusiasm that battling them felt less like conflict and more like conversation. Everyone here was new to something. Nudus. The world was still establishing its dimensions. Rustboro itself was the first city in Hoenn that felt genuinely urban, with its gym, its school, and its Devon Corporation headquarters, creating a sense of industry and institution that the small towns before it had not suggested. The Devon building was the tallest structure the player had seen at that point in the game, and the organization inside it was clearly connected to something larger than any one player's adventure. The researchers and delivery systems and specialized manufacturing operations all implied a company with decades of history and established relationships with the region's economy. The school in Rustboro offered lessons about game mechanics, delivered by a teacher in a way that felt genuinely earnest rather than condescending. The students inside had their own questions and their own half-understood knowledge, and talking to them produced the texture of a real learning environment where information was circulating at different levels of accuracy and where the teacher was working to bring everyone toward the same reliable understanding. It was a small and easily overlooked location, but it suggested that Hoenn's world contained education as a value, that the people in it wanted to understand things and had built institutions around that desire. The gym leader Roxanne was the clearest expression of this educational theme in the early game. She was both a teacher and a trainer, someone who had organized her relationship with rock-type Pokémon around a philosophy of study and mastery rather than raw affinity. Her team used the terrain and the type advantages of her specialty with a methodical quality that reflected genuine understanding of what her creatures could do. Defeating her required the same understanding applied from the other direction. The Petalburg Woods offered the game's first real wilderness experience, a dense forest that the path wound through rather than over, where tall trees limited visibility and the encounters shifted to reflect a different ecology from the open routes on either side. Shroomish appeared here, a small mushroom creature with an expression of mild irritability that made it look like something that had been bothering to grow for a while and was not pleased about the interruption of being noticed. Its evolutionary form, Breloom would become one of the generation's most unexpectedly effective competitive creatures. But in the forest, it was simply a round fungi with a mood. Silcoon and Cascoon occupied the trees of Petalburg Woods, each one a white or purple silk bundle, waiting with the particular patience of something mid-transformation. Both would become different creatures, beautifully or dustox depending on which cocoon had been encountered, and the distinction between them in this stage was visual but not functional. They were both waiting, and waiting was all they were currently doing, and the game allowed players to observe that waiting without comment. The zigzagoon that scattered across the forest floor with their erratic paths were present here as everywhere in early Hoenn, but the forest context gave them a slightly different quality. In open routes, they were simply common. In the woods, their zigzag movement felt like navigation, like a creature that had found a productive strategy for moving through a space where obstacles appeared unexpectedly and required constant, small adjustments. The environment and the behavior aligned in a way that made the common encounter briefly interesting again. Verdanturf Town sat in a pocket between mountains whose geography had produced unusually clean air, a detail the game noted in the town's description and which was visible in the lighter color palette of the surrounding routes. People had chosen to live there specifically because of the air, the kind of decision that implied a level of attention to environmental quality that most locations in the game took for granted. The town existed because its residents valued something specific and had moved toward it. The contest hall in Verdanturf was smaller than the one in Lily Cove, and the competitions there were entry-level, the first opportunity for players who wanted to explore that parallel progression. The atmosphere was accordingly less formal, more exploratory, the performances less polished, and the judging less severe. It was a space for trying things rather than for demonstrating mastery, and the social texture of the hall reflected that distinction. People were learning what the category even meant, discovering whether beauty or coolness or toughness was the quality their current team expressed most naturally. The tunnel that connected Verdanturf to Moville was a feature that the game introduced as already partially dug, its completion dependent on an item the player would later acquire and bring back. This delayed feature, a shortcut that required investment before it became available, was a structural example of the game's broader principle that certain forms of access needed to be earned or prepared for. The tunnel was always going to be there. The question was when you would have what you needed to use it. Mauville City was Hoenn's central hub, the city positioned at the geographic midpoint of the region from which routes extended in all four cardinal directions. Its gym sat at the center of a wheel-shaped city plan, and the electric-type specialty of its leader felt appropriate to the city's role as the point through which everything passed. Electricity is transmission, the movement of energy from source to destination, and Watson's cheerful engagement with his specialty felt like someone who understood what it meant to be a connector, to be the place where things came through. Route 117 extended west from Moville through flowered terrain toward Verdanturf, and it was one of the game's most visually comfortable routes, a path through meadow and gentle elevation that rewarded walking slowly. The Pokémon daycare sat along this route, offering the game's primary breeding facility in a location that felt appropriately pastoral. Leaving Pokemon at the daycare and returning later to find a new egg was one of the game's quietest rituals, something that happened at the edges of the main adventure and produced results that might take generations of successive breeding to fully realize. The couple who ran the daycare were the game's most consistently present minor characters across the franchise, appearing in some form in nearly every region. In Hoenn, their version occupied the meadow route between the electric hub and the clean air town, and they went about their work with the particular combination of attentiveness and detachment that good care requires. They noticed what was happening with the Pokemon in their charge without directing it, creating conditions, and then allowing outcomes. The magma emblem and the hidden entrance to the magma hideout were examples of Hoenn's approach to gating content through item possession. The player could walk past the entrance dozens of times without triggering anything, because the entrance only responded to the specific item in the player's possession. This meant that areas of the world were effectively invisible until you had acquired the key to perceiving them, a design choice that made revisiting earlier locations after new acquisitions feel genuinely rewarding rather than mechanically obligatory. This same principle operated across the game in different forms. The Whalmer blocking a coastal path that could only be moved by a specific song, the vines that couldn't be cut without the right tool, the rocks that couldn't be moved without the right Pokemon. Each blockage was not an absence of something to do, but a presence of something waiting for the right moment. The world was full before the player arrived, and the player's growing capability revealed more of what had always been there rather than adding new content to a previously empty space. The feeling this created was one of discovery rather than construction, of finding things that existed rather than creating things that didn't. Walking through a route after acquiring a new HM and suddenly noticing passages that had been there all along but inaccessible created the specific pleasure of finally understanding something you had been looking at without seeing. The world was patient about waiting to be understood. The cable car that ascended Mount Chimney was one of Hoenn's more explicit acknowledgments that its human inhabitants had built technology in response to the natural world rather than in opposition to it. The mountain was not navigable on foot in all places, and the cable car was the practical solution a community had arrived at, the infrastructure of accommodation. Taking it to the summit was not dramatic. It was simply the way you got there, and the view from the ascending car of the volcanic landscape below was something the game provided without announcing. The jagged pass that descended from the summit through irregular terrain required the mock bike to navigate effectively, its loose stone slopes demanding a specific approach. The trainers along the jagged pass had a roughness to their presentation that matched the terrain, people who had chosen to train in difficult conditions and had developed a directness as a result. The pass was not hostile, but it was not welcoming either. It was simply difficult, and the difficulty was the point, and the people who were there had decided the difficulty was worth what the location offered. The Team Magma members who occupied sections of the jagged pass and the summit approaches were more visible here than almost anywhere else, their ideology and their presence overlapping with a landscape that expressed volcanic force without apology. They had come to this mountain because it represented what they believed the world should prioritize, and encountering them against the backdrop of actual volcanic activity gave their convictions a physical context that their hideout's artificial environment could not provide. Route 111 was Hoenn's longest route and its most ecologically varied, extending from the desert in its center through mountain territory and connecting eventually to the river routes that led northward toward the rain. The desert section, in the middle, required goggles to navigate without losing visibility, and the sandstorm that perpetually occupied it damaged any Pokemon that was not rock, steel, or ground type with each passing turn. This made extended exploration of the deserts challenging and gave the Cacnea and Trapinch that lived there a native advantage over visiting teams. The fossils that would eventually produce Lileep and Anorith were found in this desert, handed over by a researcher who had completed his excavation and was looking for someone to carry the remains to a revival facility. This casual transfer of something ancient and irreplaceable, conducted roadside in a desert between a researcher and a passing trainer, was entirely typical of how Hoenn handled its most significant items. The most important things were often passed between people without ceremony, their significance apparent only to those who already knew what they were carrying. The Ruin Maniac's tunnel on the edge of the desert was being dug at a rate connected to the number of Pokémon in the Relic Stone location on Route 114, a mechanical relationship that the game revealed only to players who investigated both locations carefully. The more fossils revived, the further the tunnel extended, and the further the tunnel extended, the more of the creature living inside it became accessible. This cross-location dependency, where action in one place changed conditions in another, created the texture of a world where things were genuinely connected rather than simply adjacent. Falarbor Town sat at the far north of a route system that required ascending through several layers of terrain, and its distance from the main path gave it the quality of a place that most people reached by intention rather than by accident. The researchers who lived there were studying the meteor shower that recurred over the area, the kind of long-term observational work that required a stable location and a willingness to remain in one place across many years. Their presence in this remote town was the natural result of their work, not a quirk, but a professional consequence. The contest hall in Falarbor was another entry-level venue, this one in a town so far from the main traffic routes that the competitions there had a slightly more local character, competitors who had come specifically to this town rather than passing through it on the way to something else. The small scale of the facility and the modest level of the competitions available created an atmosphere of genuine community around the contest culture here rather than the more formal character of the larger venues. The meteor-related lore threaded through Falarbor's context, connected to Meteor Falls to the south and to the Space Center in Moss Deep to the east, creating a line of celestial interest across the region that was never made explicit as a thematic unit, but which rewarded players who traced the connections. Hoenn was a region shaped by the sky as much as by the sea, and the interest in what fell from above ran parallel to the interest in what lived below the water. The trick to finding Phoebus was one piece of knowledge that the game's community processed collectively before any individual player could reliably act on it alone. Players who had found Phoebus shared their tile locations, but the tiles reset based on a number that was different for every cartridge and changed with each new phrase entered into the trendy phrase system in Dewford Town. This meant that tile locations shared by one player would not necessarily apply to another player's game, and the knowledge that had been hard-won through many hours of fishing was not transferable in the way most game knowledge was. This non-transferability was unusual and created a particular kind of community around the mystery. Players could share strategies, approaches, and encouragement, but the specific answer that would work for one cartridge might be useless for another. Everyone who found Phoebus found it through their own search, using their own methodology, arriving at their own specific tiles. The collective knowledge was about process rather than location, about how to approach the search rather than where to look. The patience this required was the same patience the game embedded in its other rare encounters and its other hidden systems, and the players who found Phoebus were often the same players who had waited for Mirage Island and who had spent hours in the desert ruins reading about Braille, and who had come to understand that Hoenn's most significant discoveries required the willingness to spend time in uncertain pursuit of something that was definitely there, but not immediately available. Melodic's battle utility, once the player had navigated all of the requirements of its evolution, was significant enough to justify the investment in competitive contexts and poetic enough to feel appropriate in casual ones. A creature that had required extraordinary effort to obtain, and that emerged as something of exceptional beauty and durability, was a coherent narrative expressed through gameplay mechanics rather than through cutscenes or dialogue. The story was told by the process of playing rather than by the process of watching. The Magma and Aqua storylines intersected with the player's journey in a pattern that became clearer in retrospect than it was during the experience of playing. Both organizations were operating simultaneously throughout the game, their activities occasionally crossing the player's path, but mostly running in parallel tracks that converged toward the end. The moment when both groups arrived at the same location, pursuing the same goal, and the moment when the goal was achieved and immediately became catastrophic, had a structural inevitability that the preceding experience had been building toward without announcing. The decision to make both organizations sympathetic in their stated goals, while catastrophically wrong in their methods, was a significant tonal choice for a game aimed at a broad age range. Neither Magma nor Aqua was simply villainous. They had constructed coherent, if ultimately flawed, visions of a better world, and their members believed those visions with genuine conviction. The sincerity of their wrongness made them more uncomfortable to engage with than simple selfishness would have, and more interesting. The player's character, moving through this conflict, was not particularly ideological. The game gave no extended opportunity to articulate a worldview or argue for a position. The player acted because action was required, and the action happened to be correct, and the correctness was not celebrated in any elaborate way. The ancient forces were calmed, the weather was restored, and the world continued. This low-key resolution, appropriate for something that had been mythologically enormous in scale, was a kind of tonal maturity that the game wore without self-congratulation. The areas of Hoenn that required specific Pokémon to access were not always immediately obvious about what specifically they required. Rock Smash could shatter certain boulders, but not others. Strength moved large stones, but only after a specific gym badge authorized the field use. This authorization system, where the badge legitimized the tool, was never fully explained, but implied a relationship between the gym system and the broader infrastructure of the region, as though the gym leaders had not just organized a competition, but had also organized the rules of what capability levels permitted, which kinds of environmental interaction. The relationship between badge acquisition and field move access was not a perfect logical system. Some gym leaders awarded badges that authorized moves unrelated to their own specialty, but the progression it created, where each badge opened a new category of environmental engagement in addition to the conventional marker of achievement, made the act of earning badges feel structurally meaningful rather than purely sequential. You were not only demonstrating readiness to face the next leader, you were acquiring the permissions of the world. The 8 badges, collected across the full width and breadth of the region from Rustboro in the west to Sotopolis in the hidden crater, were each attached to a personality, a location, an aesthetic, and a type that the gym leader had built their life around. The collection of all 8 was a record of all the places visited and all the encounters resolved, and the shape of that collection was different for every player who assembled it, because the order of approach varied, and the experiences that accumulated around each badge differed based on when and how each was reached. The Skarmory that patrolled the routes near Fortree had a design that communicated its function clearly. Its body was armored steel, its wings were sharp enough to function as blades, and its movement through the air had the deliberate quality of something that had no natural predators and knew it. The creatures that lived near Fortree were generally more capable than those in the routes leading to it, reflecting the aerial environment of the treetop city and the challenge that the nearby Weather Institute's narrative context brought to the area. Fortree itself was accessible only after obtaining the Devon scope, an item that revealed an invisible Kecleon blocking the bridge into town. The creature was not hiding aggressively. It was simply present in a form that the unaided eye could not register, and the scope made it perceptible. This small mystery, a creature that was always there but required a specific device to interact with, was a miniature version of the game's broader relationship with hidden things. The things that were invisible were not absent. The equipment to see them was the only thing missing. The gym in Fortree was built around wind currents that rotated fans to block or permit passage, requiring players to move through the gym in a sequence that the rotating barriers dictated rather than the sequence the player might naturally choose. Winona, the flying type leader who waited at the end of this wind puzzle, had the composure of someone who had spent a great deal of time at altitude, where perspective is different and distances feel less absolute than they do at ground level. Her team was built for aerial mobility and capable of disrupting ground-based strategies with consistent efficiency. The Moss Deep Gym's double battle format required players to think about team composition in a way that most of the game had not forced. Bringing a pair of Pokémon to a double battle meant understanding not just what each creature could do in isolation, but what each creature enabled for the other. The gym leaders Tate and Liza used this principle deliberately, their pair of creatures sharing type synergy and move interactions that would be invisible to a player who had not thought carefully about simultaneous presence. The Space Center adjacent to the gym operated on a different axis of engagement, one that did not require battle strategy, but did require attention to the ambient information the game provided. The researchers there spoke about ongoing projects, launches, and the instruments they used to track things beyond the planet's atmosphere. Visiting the Space Center was one of those optional conversations that most players skimmed, but which rewarded more careful reading with a slightly fuller picture of what humanity in this world was doing with its curiosity beyond the scope of the Pokemon journey. The meteorite in the Space Center was a specific item with a specific purpose, connectable to an event in Fallerbor Town and to the ongoing mystery of Jirachi, a creature that would not be directly accessible through ordinary gameplay, but whose presence was implied by the item's existence and the conversations surrounding it. Jirachi slept in the comet that Moss Deep was tracking, and the instruments pointed at the sky were, in some sense, pointed toward a creature that most players would never meet, but whose sleep was continuous and real within the world's fiction. The seafloor cavern was reached through the deepest accessible underwater area in the game, a cave whose entrance sat at the bottom of the diving routes between the major water routes. The path through it was organized like a compression chamber, each room reducing the available space and increasing the sense of having descended beyond easy return. The creatures encountered inside were those that lived permanently in the absence of natural light, adapted to pressure and darkness and the particular ecology of a space where the rules of the surface world no longer fully applied. The encounter with Kyogre or Groudon in the deepest chamber of the seafloor cavern had the quality of something that had been sleeping there for a very long time and was not pleased about being awakened. The ancient Pokémon did not wait for the player to initiate the encounter in the conventional way. The circumstances created by the villain organization's actions forced the encounter, and the creature moved in response to conditions rather than to any invitation. It was not capturable in the conventional sense at this point. It was a force being released. The scene that followed, the legendary creature returning to the surface and immediately altering the weather of the entire region, was one of the generation game's most dramatic narrative moments, and also one of its most honest. The scale of what had been awakened exceeded anything the player's team could simply address. The intervention of Rayquaza, descending from its habitual altitude to resolve a conflict between forces it had mediated before, was necessary and felt earned by the mythology that the game had been building toward it across many hours of play. The post-Rayquaza world was a quieter place, the weather restored to its natural variation, and the ancient forces returned to whatever rest they maintained between their mythological engagements. The world had continued, and the player's adventure within it had not ended, but had shifted from the dramatic to the persistent. There were still badges to collect if any had been missed, still creatures to find in routes that had not been fully explored, still contests to enter, and berry trees to tend, and hidden bases to expand with new furniture. This return to the ordinary after the extraordinary was a structural feature of Hoenn's narrative, and it reflected something true about how crises end. The weather cleared, people went back to their work. The old man in Pacifid Log resumed his eastward watch. The berry master continued distributing his daily gifts. The trick master rearranged his house for the next visitor, while the contest judges took their seats for the next performance. The world was restored not to stasis, but to its ordinary motion, which was complex and ongoing and indifferent to whether the player was paying attention. The Elite Four were accessible now if they hadn't been defeated already, and the champion's room beyond them held the specific quality of a destination earned across an entire journey. Players who arrived at Steven's room understood that the team they were bringing had been assembled across every route and every decision and every earlier battle they had fought. The championship was not a culmination so much as a crystallization, a moment where everything that had been accumulating became visible all at once. The National Pokédex, unlocked after completing the regional one and receiving it from the professor, opened the possibility of encountering creatures from earlier generations in specific locations throughout Hoenn. These appearances were not announced. Players who were familiar with earlier generations recognized them, and players who were not simply encountered a creature they hadn't seen before and added it to their expanding record. The world had become larger without announcing that it was doing so, which was entirely consistent with how Hoenn handled its revelations. The Pokéradar equivalent features available in the post-game allowed to chain encounters, where repeatedly finding the same species in the same location increased the probability of finding a particularly rare or differently colored version. This mechanic required patience of a specific and intense kind, maintaining a chain while not breaking it through wrong movement or encountering the wrong species, and the mental focus required was different from the calm, expansive patience of waiting for Mirage Island. It was a demanding patience rather than a restful one, alert and continuous rather than open and available. The different varieties of post-game content in Hoenn asked for different qualities from players, and the range of those qualities mirrored the range that the main game had explored. There was patient searching, careful strategy, aesthetic appreciation, mechanical precision, social engagement, and simple exploration. No single mode of engagement was privileged over others. The world was rich enough to reward whatever approach the player brought to it. The Pokéblock blending minigame that ran during contest preparation was one of the game's more social optional features, producing better results when multiple players participated simultaneously than when one player worked alone. The berries combined in the blender produced a Pokéblock whose quality depended on the speed of button timing across all participating players, with more consistent group timing producing a more effective result. This gentle incentive for cooperation in a game otherwise organized around individual achievement was a quiet expression of Hoenn's broader relationship with community. The categories of Pokéblock, each affecting a different contest condition, required understanding both what you wanted to achieve and what berries produced which effects. This knowledge could be acquired through experimentation, through reading item descriptions, or through conversations with other players, and the route you took to understanding it shaped what you knew and how you knew it. Players who had worked it out through experimentation understood it differently from players who had been told, and both understandings were complete, even if they felt different. The Pokemon that benefited most from specific contest conditions often had move pools that aligned with those conditions, creating a natural synergy between a creature's battle capabilities and its performance potential. A Pokemon with powerful fire moves might also have the moves best suited for tough or cool appeals. A creature with supportive or subtle moves might excel in clever or cute categories. The game's mechanics were layered enough that creatures could be understood as battle partners, performance artists, or ecological inhabitants, and all three framings revealed something true about them. The small islands scattered across Hoenn's ocean were each individually realized enough to feel like places rather than points on a map. The island where Moss Deep sat had the Space Center and the gym and a quiet community that had organized itself around proximity to the sea in ways that the mainland communities had not. The smaller islands accessible through diving or surfing were often wild areas, uninhabited by humans, their terrain and their Pokemon populations expressing what the region looked like before any human infrastructure had been built around it. Log's floating log town was the most unusual human settlement in the region, a community built on an infrastructure that required constant maintenance and that moved with the current in ways that permanent buildings could not accommodate. The logs beneath the town were held together and periodically replaced, the town's foundation as much ongoing project as established structure. Living there required a relationship with impermanence that most settlements managed to avoid, and the people of Log had built a culture around that relationship rather than against it. The current that ran east of the town toward the Evergrande City area required specific navigation to move against, and the Evergrande approach through Victory Road felt like a pilgrimage route, a path that became more demanding and more clarifying as it progressed. The wild Pokemon in Victory Road were among the strongest available before the Elite Four, and encountering them while already anticipating the battles ahead produced the specific alertness of someone who could not afford to treat anything casually anymore. The Evergrande city that housed the Pokemon League was in most meaningful senses a single building surrounded by the landscape of the Victory Road's exit plateau. There was a Pokemon Center, as there was everywhere significant, and there was the League building itself, and the combination of those two structures expressed the game's basic philosophy about difficulty and restoration. You could heal, and then you could try, and if you failed, you could heal again, and the trying would continue until you were ready. The music of the League building carried a formality that the rest of the game's soundtrack had only approached in specific moments. It was not intimidating, but it was serious, the kind of music that exists in spaces where something that matters is about to happen. Players who had developed a relationship with the soundtrack across many hours of play felt the shift when they entered and recognized it as appropriate rather than manufactured. The Elite Four rooms were each distinct environments reflecting the type specialty of the trainer within them. The transition from one room to the next was a shift in palette and atmosphere as much as a shift in mechanical challenge, and the cumulative journey through all four before reaching the champion felt like moving through layers of something, each layer clarifying the nature of what waited at the center. The world of Hoenn, taken as a whole, was an argument made in the language of geography and creature design and mechanical system for a particular way of understanding the relationship between exploration and understanding. The mysteries it contained were not problems waiting for solutions, but spaces waiting for inhabitation, questions that became more interesting the longer they were held rather than less interesting once they were answered. The civilization that had sealed the Regis and left behind Braille was gone, and it was gone in a way that could not be researched or restored, its absence final, and the traces it left behind the only conversation still available. The organizations that had tried to improve the world through force had been stopped, but the impulses that had driven them were not destroyed, only redirected, and the world they had almost catastrophically changed was still the world it had been, changed only in the ways that every day changes a world by passing through it. The creatures that lived in Hoenn were living their lives in a world that was not primarily organized around their observation. They swam in the deep water and patrolled the sky routes and waited in the desert and rested in caves and moved through tall grass and floated above cemeteries and bobbed in the ocean and stood in meadows pointing north, all of them engaged with the specific conditions of their specific locations in ways that the player's passage through could witness but not fundamentally alter. This quality of a world persisting beyond the edge of the screen, continuing in places the player had left and in places the player had never found, was the deepest kind of world building that the medium allowed. Hoenn was not a stage set erected for the player's benefit and dismantled in their absence. It was a place, and the player had visited it, and it remained after the visit in the way that places remain, full of the things that had been there before the arrival and indifferent to the departure. The water around Hoenn still moves tonight, and the ash still falls quietly on the route near the volcano, and Mirage Island appears or does not appear according to the same invisible logic it has always followed, and somewhere in the ozone layer, a long green creature moves through its habitual altitude, aware of nothing below that requires its attention, and the old man on the floating logs looks east into the dark water and continues looking, because some things are worth watching for, regardless of whether they appear. The roots of northern Hoenn carried a quality distinct from those in the south, shaped by the rain that fell consistently across the upper portion of the region and the mountains that caught and held that weather in place. Route 119 was the longest of these northern routes, a wide path through tall grass and shallow water crossings that required surf to navigate fully. The constant rain altered the color of everything beneath it, softening the greens of the grass and the grays of the rock into something that felt more unified than the bright, distinct colors of the routes below the mountain divide. The tall grass on Route 119 was tall enough to conceal Pokémon until the moment of encounter, which gave movement through it a specific quality of uncertainty. The creatures living there were not dramatically different from those in other routes, but their appearance felt slightly more surprising each time, because the rain and the height of the grass together created an environment where the edge of visibility was constantly close. Walking through Route 119 slowly was a different experience from crossing it quickly, and the game rewarded the slower approach with encounters and with the texture of the place itself. The Weather Institute was the destination most players had in Route 119, but the route extended significantly beyond it, climbing past the Institute toward Fortree and offering encounters with Tropius in the southern portion, one of the few routes in Hoenn where the large fruit-bearing dinosaur could be found. Its unhurried presence in the rainy tall grass suited it perfectly, a creature with no urgency drifting through a landscape that was itself in no particular hurry to change. The relationship between Hoenn's cities and their geographic contexts was one of the region's consistent pleasures for players who paid attention to the logic of where things were and why. Laveridge sat at the base of a volcano because the hot springs that defined the town required the volcanic activity. Dewford sat on an island because its gym leader's philosophy required isolation. Fortree sat in trees because the elevation offered access to a kind of connection with the aerial world that ground-level habitation couldn't provide. This environmental logic extended to the creatures that appeared near each city. The fire-type Pokémon that occupied the routes near Laveridge were not there arbitrarily. The flying-type creatures that proliferated in the area around Fortree were there because the region's ecology supported them. The water-type variety that surrounded Satopolis reflected both the city's crater lake and the broader ocean it sat within. The world's organization felt like consequence rather than convenience, which made moving through it feel like moving through something real Slateport relationship with the ocean went beyond simple geography. The city was organized around maritime activity in the way that real port cities are, with the harbor, the market, and the shipyard all connected by the logic of things that arrive by sea and things that depart by sea. The museum's displays of ocean life reflected the scientific interest of a community that lived alongside the water and had decided to understand it rather than simply use it. The aesthetic of the villainous teams in Hoenn was more elaborate than in previous generations, their uniforms and hideouts reflecting genuine visual identity rather than generic threat. Team Magma's dark red and black palette suggested volcanic rock and hardened decisions. Team Aqua's blue and white uniform suggested ocean surface and the particular clarity that comes from having already made up your mind. Both teams had decided something, had organized their lives around that decision, and their appearance communicated the commitment. The grunts, who occupied the lower levels of both organizations, were interesting in their casualness. They were not menacing in any practiced way. They were employees of a cause, doing what they had been told to do in the locations they had been assigned, and their battle dialogue often reflected a confusion about the larger purpose they were serving that made them more sympathetic than their presence in the villain's organization might have suggested. They believed in the mission without necessarily understanding it, which was recognizable as a very human quality. The admins and leaders of both organizations were more fully committed and more fully aware of the contradictions in their methods, and the moments of confrontation with them had a quality of genuine disagreement rather than simple obstacle clearing. They had thought about what they were doing, even if they had thought about it from within a framework that excluded certain crucial considerations. Engaging with them felt like engaging with people who were wrong rather than with obstacles that needed to be removed. The southern routes of Hoenn before the Pokémon League had a different character from the routes encountered earlier in the game, partly because the player's team was more capable, and partly because the game's narrative had already resolved its central conflict, leaving the routes as spaces for consolidation rather than discovery. The Pokemon encountered there were higher level, and the terrain was more demanding, but the sense of urgency that had shaped earlier traversal was absent. These were routes for wandering rather than advancing. The presence of Absol on Route 120 fit this southern section's character well, a creature that appeared in quiet places at the edges of things, rare enough to require deliberate searching, but not impossible to find, carrying its history of misunderstanding without any visible distress. Players who came to Route 120 specifically looking for one often came after having heard about it from somewhere else, and the specific quality of searching for something you've been told exists but haven't yet seen has its own texture, distinct from stumbling across the unexpected. Route 121 led toward Mount Pyre and the northern approach to Lily Cove, and traveling it felt like moving through the end of one section of the world and into another. The Safari Zone entrance was here, the beginning of the patient preserve system that rewarded return visits, and the trainers on the route were among the more thoughtful in design, using teams that reflected deliberate choices about how different creatures could support each other rather than simply collections of locally available Pokemon. The design philosophy that had produced Hoenn's most unusual creatures was visible in retrospect as a coherent aesthetic interest in biological improbability made plausible. Claydol, which evolved from the spinning doll creature Baltoy, was presented as a creature that had been made as an artifact thousands of years ago, and had animated the boundary between craft and life, erased by time and whatever force operated in the space between very old things and the world around them. Its psychic and ground typing made sense within that history, a creature of ancient Earth animated by forces no longer fully understood. Bennett was created from an abandoned doll, a plush toy whose accumulated resentment at being discarded had generated a spirit capable of independent movement. Its design expressed this origin directly. A zipper mouth kept sealed against the release of the curses it contained, a body still recognizable as the stuffed creature it had been before something changed. The game did not explain what enabled the transition from discarded toy to haunted entity, which was the correct choice. Certain things are more unsettling for their lack of mechanism. Duskull drifted through the roots around Mount Pyre as a visual pun on the Grim Reaper at small scale, its single red eye visible through the skeletal face pattern on its black form. Its pre-evolution stage and its relatively gentle disposition in its Pokédex entries created a slight tension with its visual grammar, a creature that looked like a herald of endings behaving more like a curious wanderer. This gap between appearance and nature was a device Hoenn's ghost-type designs used consistently, and it made each of them feel more specific than their aesthetic category alone would suggest. The Cave of Origin's internal layout was simpler than its narrative weight suggested it should be. A few rooms, a descending path, and then the chamber where the legendary creature waited. This simplicity was appropriate in the same way that very important moments are often simpler than the lead up to them. The extensive mythology, the ancient organizations, the weather catastrophe, the intervention of Rayquaza, all of it had been the lead up, and the cave itself was where the story went quiet and asked for something more direct. The design of the chamber where the legendary Pokémon was encountered reflected the elemental identity of the creature it housed. Groudon's chamber felt geothermally heated, its rock walls textured with a dryness that the roots outside had not had. Kyogre's chamber felt like standing in a space where the humidity was high enough to be visible, where the water-shaped stone suggested a chamber that had been formed by long contact with the ocean. These were visual and atmospheric effects rather than mechanical ones, but they completed the experience of the encounter in a way that a generic chamber would not have. The decision to let the player catch the legendary at this point in the story, rather than after the conflict had resolved, was one of the game's more interesting structural choices. The creature that had been threatening the world was also the creature the player was invited to add to their team. This dual quality, catastrophic and catchable, ancient and available, was part of what made Hoenn's legendaries feel different from purely symbolic presences. They were real within the world's logic, and their reality included the possibility of relationship. The hidden base items that could be obtained through various means reflected a kind of taxonomy of interior design that the game's world treated as genuinely important. Dolls, cushions, large furniture pieces, television sets, and posters all had specific placements that changed the character of the base they occupied. A base filled with large plush dolls had a different quality from one organized around tables and shelves. Players who spent time decorating their bases were engaging in a form of creative expression that the game accommodated without directing, providing the materials and the space, and then leaving the arrangement entirely to the individual. The ability for other players to visit hidden bases and battle the team left there added a social dimension to what might otherwise have been a purely personal activity. Your base was a kind of self-portrait, a space organized by your tastes and defended by your team, available to anyone who found it. The flag system that tracked visits gave the activity a purpose beyond expression, making the bases into waypoints on a social map that the multiplayer community could navigate. The multiplayer dimension of Hoenn's systems was consistently present, but never mandatory. Trading and battling were available, the Union Room accessible from any Pokémon Center, and the mechanics that worked better with multiple players were rewarding without being inaccessible to those playing alone. The game was aware that its players lived in different social circumstances, and had built its optional systems to add depth for those who had other players available without withholding anything essential from those who did not. The relationship between Hoenn's music and its specific moments was more compositionally intentional than players often noticed during a first playthrough. The theme that accompanied encounters with legendary Pokémon was different from that used for standard battles, slower in its opening and carrying more harmonic weight in the way that music expands when it needs to mark something as significant. The encounter music for the Reggie trio was particularly distinctive, a sparse and repeating phrase that created tension through what it didn't include as much as through what it did. The town themes ranged from Oldale's gentle and slightly uncertain opening, appropriate for a town that was the first real settlement, to Sotoplis's meditative quality that reflected the stillness of the crater lake and the age of the rocks surrounding it. Lily Cove's theme had a busyness that matched the city's size and variety, and Fortrees felt like wind through leaves in a way that was not literally descriptive, but emotionally accurate. The composers had matched music to location without being obvious about it, and the effect was felt rather than noticed. The battle music for gym leaders was more insistent than the standard wild battle theme, its tempo slightly elevated and its melodic content more declarative, communicating that what was about to happen mattered more than a random encounter in the grass. This distinction in the music prepared players for a different quality of engagement before the battle began, creating an anticipatory state that the mechanics then needed to justify. When a gym battle was difficult, the music's insistence felt earned. When it was not, the music's seriousness could make the easy victory feel slightly anticlimactic, which was its own kind of information. The surf mechanic, which opened most of Hoenn's water routes, was one of the generation's most used field moves, and the Pokémon that most commonly provided it occupied a variety of forms across the game. Tentacruel could learn it, as could the Wingull line and various water types encountered across the region. The choice of which Pokémon provided surf was not only practical, but aesthetic. The creature that carried the player across the water becoming part of how that water was experienced. The transition from land to water when using surf was marked by a visual change and an audio cue, the battle music on land giving way to the different ambient sound of the open water routes. This sensory shift made the boundary between land and water feel like a genuine ecological boundary rather than a simple zone change, a reinforcement of the idea that the ocean was a different environment governed by different logic rather than just a terrain type with different encounters. The creatures encountered while surfing occupied the surface layer of the ocean, and the creatures encountered while diving occupied the layer below it, and this vertical distribution of encounter types created the texture of an actual aquatic ecosystem where different species occupied different depths according to their biology and their needs. Moving between depths felt like moving between neighborhoods in a city, each with its characteristic inhabitants and its characteristic atmosphere. The finale of the journey, standing at the entrance to the Elite Four with a team assembled across hundreds of hours of exploration and development, was a moment that the game never explicitly marked as significant. There was no ceremony around the approach, no music cue that announced the culmination. The League building stood where it had always stood, its doors accessible as soon as the player had the 8 required badges, and the experience of entering it was continuous with every other transition the game had offered rather than architecturally distinct from them. This refusal to underline its own culmination was one of Hoenn's most thoughtful structural choices. The significance of the moment was something the player brought to it from everything that had come before, and the game trusted that accumulation to do the work without needing assistance. Players who had spent the most time in Hoenn, who had fished for Phoebus and waited for Mirage Island and explored every branch of the Safari Zone and completed the Master Rank contests, arrived at the Elite Four with something different in their relationship to the journey than players who had moved through more directly. The same doors, but different arrivals. Beyond the champion and the credits and the post-game expansion, the world of Hoenn remained available to revisit without the structure of the main journey organizing the experience. This open post-game version of the region was in some ways its truest form, the world without the narrative scaffolding, available to be explored on its own terms rather than in service of any external progression. The mystery locations that had been accessible but peripheral during the main story could now be returned to with full attention, and the creatures that had been rare enough to defer during the rush of the main journey could now be sought with the unhurried focus they deserved. The old man kept looking east. The ash kept falling. The tide kept moving through the cave entrances and back out again. Hoenn persisted in the way that places persist, full of the qualities that had made it worth visiting and entirely indifferent to whether it was being visited at all. Rest now and let it continue without you for a while. It will still be there whenever you return.